Hey everyone, I'm the narrator, Caetano, and you're watching Beatles Bible. Today is a very special day for the channel. We are actually celebrating the 3rd anniversary of Beatles Bible. That's right, 3 incredible years. And to celebrate this awesome milestone, we have decided to do something to give back to you, this incredible community of fans and supporters who've made this whole journey possible. We are doing a special giveaway where you can win an exclusive Beatles t-shirt, and you can pick which design you prefer here. This giveaway runs from April 15th to 17th. This contest is not sponsored by YouTube. We are solely responsible for distributing the prize. You have to be based in the United States of America to participate. Here's how you can enter. 1, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You already were going to. And 2, like this video and leave a comment below telling us your favorite song from the White Album and why. Only comments posted between April 15th and 17th will be eligible. If you post after that, it's not going to count. The winner will then be chosen at random. Here's how we're going to verify you're the actual winner. After we announce the winner on our community tab, it's also known as the post tab, on April 18th, you'll email us to claim your prize at our official email address, BeatlesBibleContact@gmail.com. We'll reply with a unique verification code. To confirm that the comment that won is you, you will edit your comment that won to include the special code we send you. So if we send you Knickerbockers, you will edit your comment on this video, say blah, 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 Knickerbockers at the end of it. That way, we'll know it's really you, and we'll send it out. We'll send it over to you. So, good luck. Unfortunately, we couldn't give shirts to everyone. But, you know, if you guys like the designs, maybe we could consider selling them. Tell us what you'd think. I know I'd buy them. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Like, obviously, this channel wouldn't exist without you guys, and I can't wait to see, you know, where the next 3 years is going to take us. So, with all of that said, let's get to the video.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.
After the serious vibe of Pepper and most of their 1967 work, the Beatles started loosening up and having more fun. Sure, the White Album sessions were famously tense, but when it came to the songs themselves, a lot of them felt way less heavy than what came before. The Beatles always had a sense of humor in their music, but on the White Album, all 4 of them leaned into eccentric lyrics and playful arrangements meant to make you grin, or at least raise an eyebrow. John brings it with Bungalow Bill and Happiness is a Warm Gun. Ringo gets goofy with Don't Pass Me By, and even the usually serious George has some fun with Piggies and Savoy Truffle. And then there's Paul, who, never one to be left out, gives us Back in the USSR, Why Don't We Do It in the Road, and the wonderfully oddball Rocky Raccoon.
Rocky Raccoon. I was sitting on the roof in India, just sort of with guitar. John and I were sitting around just playing guitar, and we were with Donovan, and we were just sitting around enjoying ourselves. And I started playing the chords of Rocky Raccoon, you know, just messing around. And originally it was Rocky Sassoon. And then we started making up the words, you know, the 3 of us, and started just to write them down. They came very quickly, and eventually I changed it from Sassoon to Raccoon, because it sounded more like a cowie. So there it is. It's just, you know, these kind of things, you can't really talk about how they come, because they just come into your head, you know, they really do. And it's like John writing his books, you know, there's no, I don't know how he does it, and he doesn't know how he does it, but he just writes. It's like any writer, you know. I think people who actually do create and write, you tend to read it and think, oh, well, now, how did he do that? But it actually does flow, just flows into their head into their hand and they write it down, And that's what happened with this. I don't know anything about the Appalachian Mountains or cowboys and Indians or anything, but I just made it up, And the doctor came in stinking of gin and proceeded to lie on the table. So there you are.
I suppose the idea to do the thing with some sort of an American Western accent also happened this way, did it? Just
that was just a joke, As most of it is.
People have speculated about where the name Rocky Raccoon came from. Some say Rocky was inspired by Rocky Erickson from the 13th floor elevators, while Sassoon could have come from either war poet Siegfried Sassoon or hairdresser Vidal Sassoon. But according to Paul in the lyrics, that's not the case. So we were doing this rap, and I just dreamt up a character called Rocky Raccoon, because of Davy Crockett with his raccoon cap. I'd watched Davy Crockett on telly, starring Fess Parker when I was a kid. I saw the TV show, but my main thing was the song, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. It was quite a cool song. Paul once called Rocky Raccoon a Mack Sennett movie set to music. Sennett was a slapstick comedy pioneer known as the King of Comedy. In the lyrics, Paul also mentions a 1907 poem, The Shooting of Dan McGrew, which, like Rocky Raccoon, features a love triangle, a gunfight, and a character named Dan. Another influence was The Lion and Albert, a darkly humorous poem about a lion eating a boy. But Paul says the song just came to him naturally. These kinds of things, you can't really talk about how they come because they just come into your head, I don't know anything about the Appalachian Mountains or cowboys and Indians or anything. But I just made it up, so there you are. He describes it as a quirky song, a mix of talking blues and a parody of a Western. He liked the idea of Rocky finding Gideon's Bible in the hotel room. Well, those were in every hotel in America. Probably still are. We'd never seen that in England, so I just thought about that image, checking into a room, looking in the desk, opening the drawer, and there's a Bible. The song's lyrics evolved over time. Early versions had Rocky coming from Minnesota instead of Dakota, and the doctor wasn't in the first demo. Paul's spoken intro may have been inspired by Lonnie Donegan's 1955 hit Rock Island Line, and the Black Hills of Dakota reference likely came from a 1953 Doris Day song. The doctor verse was inspired by a real accident. In '65, Paul fell off a moped and needed stitches. The doctor who arrived was drunk, so they got this guy, and he arrived stinking of gin. This guy was so drunk. "Hello, Paul. How are you?" "Great." "Oh yeah, that's going to need stitches. I've brought my bag." So he brings his black bag, and now he's got to try and thread a little needle, a curved surgical needle, but he's seeing 3 needles at least. I think I said, "Let us do it," and we threaded it for him, but he just put the needle in and pulled it round. And then the thread came out and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have to do that again." So he had to do it a second bloody time, and I was trying not to scream. To hide the scar, Paul grew a mustache, which led to the rest of the Beatles growing theirs too. When John was asked who wrote the song, he said, "Paul, can't you tell? Would I go through all that trouble about Gideon's Bible and that sort of thing?" He maybe got stuck on a couple of lines that I helped on, but mainly it's him. By the time Paul brought Rocky Raccoon into EMI Studio 2 on August 15th, the White Album was already more than halfway done. The band showed up sometime after 7 p.m. and started rehearsing. Even though George had played some country-style guitar licks on the Kinfons demo, he didn't actually play on the official recording that night. Instead, he hung out in the control room, which we know because he's heard announcing, "Take 1," and asking, "Paul, which verse does the piano come in on?" He asked that because George Martin was actually on the studio floor, playing a piano during the early takes. The band started recording on a 4-track tape. John played a Fender 6 bass and messed around with a harmonica. Ringo was on drums, Paul played acoustic guitar while George Martin handled piano, and Paul sang lead vocals. Paul later admitted it was tricky to record. It was a difficult song to record because it had to be all in one take. It would have been very hard to edit because of the quirkiness of the vocal, so I had to do a couple of takes until I got the right sort of feel. But it was fun to do. It actually took him 9 takes to nail it, including time spent improvising the intro and figuring out the doctor verse. In take 4, Paul sang, "Rolled up his sleeves," leading to Rocky saying, "Move over, Doc, let's have none of your That ended with Paul laughing, knows where I am, before launching into the Day Tripper riff on his acoustic guitar. It was that kind of session, casual and full of laughs. After take 5, they decided to record the piano separately later. That left Paul's acoustic guitar solo on track 3, while George Martin went back to the control room with George Harrison. Take 8, which was later released on Anthology 3, included John suggesting the phrase, "He was a fool unto himself." That intro went way deeper into the story than necessary, so Paul cut it off mid-take. Finally, take 9 was the keeper. Since they had filled up the 4-track tape, they bounced it down to make room for overdubs, calling the new version take 10. They added John's harmonica, some accordion on the second verse, background vocals from John, Paul, and George Martin's tack piano, which, according to Kevin Howlett in the White Album 50th Anniversary liner notes, was recorded at half speed to get that honky-tonk western vibe when played back at normal speed. On the surface, the structure for Rocky Raccoon is very simple, namely verse, refrain, or A-B, with a spoken word introduction thrown in at the beginning. It's unique in that the entire song follows a simple chord pattern, repeated over and over again throughout, while each of the verses is constructed of a wandering and indeterminate length. The purpose of the verses is to tell a story, not to fit within the bounds of a predetermined set of measures. In fact, earlier takes of the song had different lengths of second verses, since Paul hadn't quite decided on the exact story yet. Initially brushed off by some as a silly throwaway, Rocky Raccoon has stood the test of time, cementing itself as a quirky classic that still gets plenty of love today. One thing about Paul as a songwriter, he always did his own thing. He experimented with all kinds of styles, and while the other Beatles may have rolled their eyes when he veered too far from what they thought the band should be doing, he never let that stop him. And after they broke up, he had total freedom to go in any direction he wanted. Then again, he kind of always did.
They were recording the White Album at the time.
They were, too.
Did you really record your first album with them, which was that Sweet Baby James? Or was that James Taylor?
That was James Taylor.
James Taylor.
Yeah.
James Taylor. Did you do that while they were recording White Album at the same time?
Yes, I did. It turned out that, they usually recorded at Abbey Road, but Abbey Road didn't have an 8-track machine. And there was only one 8-track machine in Britain at the time. And that was at a studio called Trident, which was in Leicester Square. So the Beatles just booked it solid for a couple of months, and we took the time they weren't using.
Wow. Did you watch the recording of the White Album?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever covered any of the songs from the White Album? Because you would kill on Rocky Raccoon. Rocky Raccoon is right in your wheelhouse, brother.
I heard the first playback of Rocky Raccoon.
Yeah?
Yeah, at the end of that session day. Wow. It was great.
Did they ask your opinion of any of the music? What'd you think about that, James? No? No? Did you hear anything and you went, I don't get Revolution number 9. I don't understand this at all. Or like, why don't we do it in the road? You could vary up the lyrics a little bit or something like that.
No, I didn't really get Revolution number 9 either, but...
I'm still waiting. Backwards, it makes all the sense in the world.
It does, that's right.
This cheeky little nursery rhyme, written in the laid-back vibe of Rishikesh, seems like a pretty direct jab at someone trying to worm their way into the Apple crowd. This was a thing I wrote half with our electronic genius Alex Martis, John said. It was called What a Shame Mary Jane Had a Pain at the Party, and it was meant for the Beatles album. And that was me, Yoko, and George sitting on the floor at EMI fooling around. Pretty good, huh? The usual theory, that Mary Jane is just slang for weed, doesn't really explain most of the lyrics, which sound more like inside jokes about a specific person. A woman, black, possibly American, and maybe looking for a UK visa through a sketchy marriage. Not that it's much of a mystery worth solving. In the studio, the song started morphing into something pretty far out. Only John and George were involved, no Paul or Ringo this time. They laid down 4 takes on August 14th, with a little help from Yoko and Mal. John handled vocals and piano, while George played guitar, both double-tracked. They also threw in handbells, a xylophone, and a bunch of weird effects to make it sound like a seriously bad acid trip. After the Beatles split, the longest version of What's the New Mary Jane became a popular bootleg, and was eventually picked for Anthology 3. It wraps up with John saying, "Let's hear it before we get taken away." Take 1, on the other hand, didn't see the light of day until 2018, when it was included in some editions of the White Album 50th Anniversary reissue. It got left off the White Album because it simply didn't fit, but John dusted it off 15 months later, hoping to release it as a Plastic Ono Band single with You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. EMI, or maybe the other Beatles, shut that down, and the track sat in the vaults for years, somehow gaining a reputation as a lost anarchic gem.
But everything that the 4 of you have recorded that the 2 of you wrote has indeed been released in one way or another.
Yeah, except for What's the New Mary Jane, which is something, a sort of funny song, crazy song that I wrote. And that was never recorded. There's only me, George, and Yoko on it, actually. We recorded it when we got back from India. It is around on a bootleg. What a shame Mary Jane had a pain at the party. A real crack song. I always wanted to release it. It never got released.
Back in December of 1966, Paul revealed, "I like the idea of doing something solo, just for a change, because everything we did was a 4-headed monster." Over time, that idea slowly became a reality, as he started taking more control in the studio during the later years of the Beatles. George didn't mind when Paul took over lead guitar occasionally, and he even stepped in to reshape some of John's songs or replace Ringo on drums when he felt like it. With Wild Honey Pie, Paul took things a step further, recording an entire Beatles track all by himself. While most people see it as a throwaway, it was an early experiment that foreshadowed his first solo album, McCartney, 2 years later. What started as a quirky little recording eventually led to full-on one-man band projects like Maybe I'm Amazed. Looking back on it, Paul said, "It was just a fragment of an instrumental, which we were not sure about, but Patty Harrison liked it very much, so we decided to leave it on the album." The track emerged from a spontaneous sing-along in Rishikesh. It was a reference to the other song I had written called Honey Pie. Interestingly, Patty was also the inspiration behind a few other legendary songs. Something from the Beatles, Layla by Derek and the Dominos, and Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton solo. It's safe to say that she probably takes more pride in those than in Wild Honey Pie, but still. And here's a fun coincidence. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, who was also in India at the time, co-wrote a song called Wild Honey the year before. Could that have inspired Wild Honey Pie, or was it just a random connection? Who knows? On August 20th, 1968, John and Ringo dropped by EMI Studio 3 for a quick session to wrap up Your Blues and oversee the mono mix of Revolution 9. Paul wasn't there, and George was off vacationing in Greece, so it was a short and straightforward visit from the two. Later that evening, at 8 p.m., another session kicked off in EMI Studio 2, this time with only Paul. The fact that the band members were working separately like this really showed how fragmented things were at the time. John and Ringo briefly stopped by while Paul was finishing up Mother Nature's Son, but the atmosphere reportedly got a little tense until they left. At around 2 a.m., Paul started working on Wild Honey Pie. As he explained, we'd very recently done John's Your Blues, where we'd packed ourselves up into a cupboard. So we were in an experimental mode, and so I said, can I just make something up? I started off with a guitar and did a multi-tracking experiment in the control room, or maybe in the little room next door. It was very homemade. It wasn't a big production at all. I just made up the short piece, and I multi-tracked a harmony to that, and a harmony to that, and a harmony to that. And it built up sculpturally with a lot of vibrato on the strings, really pulling the strings madly. Hence Wild Honey Pie. It was a little experimental piece. The inspiration for this stripped-down approach came from Your Blues, which had been recorded a week earlier with all 4 Beatles squeezed into a tiny annex to the Studio 2 control room. That session sparked Paul's interest in doing something similar on his own. Alan Brown remembers, Paul wanted an open effect on his drums to give a bongo sound, and we ended up leaving the studio itself and putting the drums in the corridor, halfway down, with mics at the far end. It wasn't carpeted then, and it gave an interesting staccato effect. When engineer Ken Scott called out, "This is ad-lib, take 1," Paul laid down the first track with acoustic guitar and vocals, and then overdubbed himself with more guitar while playing a kick drum with a foot pedal on another track. He then added a syncopated tom drum rhythm and more harmony vocals on track 3, before topping it all off with even more harmonies on track 4. By 3 a.m., this 53-second song was done. The next hour was spent creating mono mixes for Mother Nature's Son and Wild Honey Pie, with the latter taking 6 attempts to get just right. The book included in the White Album 50th Anniversary box set explains why this took so much effort. The fluttering sound of one of the acoustic guitars was created by making the speed of the tape fluctuate slightly. This was done by brushing a hand over the metal spool while it rotated at 15 inches per second. It resulted in a sound similar to playing a cassette tape when the machine's batteries are almost flat. A few days later, on August 23rd, tape copies of recent White Album recordings, including Wild Honey Pie, were made. Mal Evans signed for them and took them away, officially sealing the fate of this quirky little track. The White Album was all about unexpected transitions, and Wild Honey Pie found its place as a very weird little bridge. After the cheerful ending of Obla Di Obla Da, this strange snippet pops in before leading into John's The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, which starts with a Spanish acoustic guitar intro. While Paul's experiment was fun, most fans and critics haven't been kind to it. Stylus magazine called it the ultimate filler track, ranking it number 1 in their top 10 filler tracks list. Ultimate Classic Rock placed it at number 3 on their 10 worst Beatles songs list, just behind Flying and Revolution 9. And in his book, Revolution, The Making of the Beatles' White Album, David Quantick summed it up with a joke. No other Beatles were harmed in the making of this song.
I like most kinds of music, so that I haven't got a bag, as they say, except the big black one in the hall outside. And this, this Obla Di, Obla Da, and USSR, and Martha, and that, like are 3 different songs altogether. And in fact, all of mine are on the LP. But I can't really say anything about that. I'm pretty diverse. You know what I mean? I haven't got one sort of thing. So this, I've no idea why it's Jamaican or anything. It's just because I like that kind of thing.
Did you write the song on your own? I mean, this isn't a combination of the Lennon-McCartney thing.
I think it was mainly me. And John's a bit more Nigerian influence. I only like to talk about it because I like it, This is a favourite of mine.
Can we just talk about this particular track? Because it's a...
Back in the USSR?
Yeah, it's a wild rocking thing.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is rock and roll, John said in '68. With less of your philosophy-rock is what we're saying to ourselves. And to get on with rocking, because rockers are what we really are. Everybody says we must do this and that, but our thing is just rocking. That's what this new record is about. Definitely rocking. It's a return to a more rock and roll sound, Paul added. We felt it was time to step back because that's what we wanted to do. In 1968, the Beatles made it clear what they had in mind for the White Album. After pushing boundaries with Sgt. Pepper and the anthem All You Need Is Love, the one thing they put on pause was straight-up, hard-hitting rock and roll. That year, they were all about studio experimentation, and, whether they meant to or not, became a big part of the Summer of Love movement. Just look at how hippies in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district followed George around, calling him their leader. But at the same time, harder rock was on the rise. The Beatles loved this new sound, and, knowing that they could rock just as hard, decided to shift gears. So when it came time to kick off the 1968 album, they made sure to open with a banger, one that's still a classic rock staple today, Back in the USSR. The idea for this song first came from the 1968 pro-British campaign, I'm Backing Britain, according to Ian MacDonald's book Revolution in the Head. This McCartney rocker was originally called I'm Backing the UK, before turning surrealistically into I'm Backing the USSR. Paul took that idea in a fun, almost comedic direction. This just sort of came, Paul said in '68. Chuck Berry once did a song called Back in the USA, which is very American, very Chuck Berry, you know. He was serving in the army, and when I get back home, I'm gonna kiss the ground, you know. Can't wait to get back to the States. It's very much an American thing, I always thought. So this one, Back in the USSR, was about, in my mind, a spy who has been in America for a long, long time. Some fellow who's been in America for a long time, and he's picked up, and he's very American, but he gets back to the USSR and he's sort of saying, leave it till tomorrow, honey, to disconnect the phone and come here, honey, with Russian women and all that.
Because I was there, I think Paul came down to the breakfast table one morning saying, hey, Mike, listen to this. And he starts strumming and singing Back in the USSR, the verses. And I said, well, Paul, what you ought to do is talk about the girls around Russia, the Ukraine girls and the Georgia on my mind and that kind of thing, which he did. So I think it was the fact I was there which caused Paul to think in terms of Beach Boys. And then my suggestion from what to do in the bridge, he took that suggestion and crafted like only Mr. Paul can.
And, obviously, Paul McCartney doesn't need much help writing a song, but that was a suggestion which he incorporated. He started thinking in a Beach Boys vernacular musically, and the result was Back in the USSR.
We'll sometimes do it in concert, especially if we have a private for a corporation. They want to hear other than just, or we want to play other than just the Beach Boys set, which is wonderful, but it's kind of fun to step out and do a Beatles song or a Rolling Stones song or a Motown song or whatever it might be.
Paul later explained, I just like the idea of Georgia girls and talking about places like the Ukraine as if they were California, you know? It was also hands across the water, which I'm still conscious of, because they like us out there, even though the bosses in the Kremlin may not. The kids do. He can't wait to get back to the Georgian mountains. George is always on my mind. There's all sorts of little jokes in it. It's a jokey song, but it's also become a bit of an anthem now. In his 2021 book, The Lyrics, Paul added, then we've got the humorous reference to Georgia on My Mind, as sung by Ray Charles, though referring to Georgia in the Soviet Union rather than the US state. That this character somehow prefers the USSR to the USA is what makes the song funny. And once we started running through the USSR territories, we could go on for hours. It's almost as if the song is writing itself at this stage. The song's lyrics also throw in some fun details, like the dreadful flight with BOAC, now British Airways, from Miami Beach, the same place the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. The line about a paper bag on his knee is likely a rare pop music reference to a barf bag. Paul also pointed out in the lyrics that some lines poke fun at the USSR itself. At a couple of points, the idea that a Russian guy is saying, you don't know how lucky you are to live in the USSR, is a bit undercut. I'm thinking of the reference to disconnecting the phone. Phone tapping was probably a part of the back-of-the-mind view of the USSR. The reference to your daddy's farm is a bit complex too, when you consider that collectivization had been the order of the day in the USSR. So daddy might be Stalin or Brezhnev, who was in power at the time. Instead of missing things like skyscrapers and hamburgers, like back in the USA, the character longs for the simple pleasures of home. Paul adds, the line "show me round your snow-peaked mountains way down south" has a bit of a naughty schoolboy tinge, not to mention "come and keep your comrade warm." The balalaika's ringing out was a nod to the traditional Russian three-stringed instrument. Mike Love had a small role in inspiring the song, but what about John? When asked in 1980 if he had contributed, Lennon made it clear, Paul completely. The Beatles got around to recording Back in the USSR on August 22nd in EMI Studio 2. The session was set to start at 7 p.m., but like most White Album sessions, they probably showed up much later. Except for Ringo, he was always on time. Engineer Ron Richards recalled, Ringo was always sitting in the reception area waiting, just sitting there or reading a newspaper. He used to sit there for hours waiting for the others to turn up. Tensions were already running high at this point, as engineer Peter Vince noted. Things were getting very strained on Beatles sessions by this time. The engineers would be asked to leave. They'd say, go off for a meal, or go off for a drink. And you know they were having heavy discussions, and didn't want anyone around. That day, things boiled over during rehearsals for Back in the USSR.
And I'm sure I pissed Ringo off when he couldn't quite get the drums to USSR and I sort of sat in. I'm actually still very aware of that. It's a very weird thing to know you can do a thing that someone else is having trouble with. Because, one, you make it very simple, but just going down and doing it and just bluffing right through it and thinking, the hell, at least I'm helping. But obviously the paranoia comes in but I'm going to show him up. And I was very sensitive to that. I still am. I remember sort of hours sitting around thinking, should I say anything? And in the end, it always came to, you should have said something. So, it's very hard to take the balance of that.
Ringo was already frustrated, and this seemed to push him over the edge. In his book, Postcards from the Boys, he recalled, every time I went for a cup of tea, Paul was on the drums. Paul had a specific drum pattern in mind and was trying to show Ringo how he wanted it played. But this time, it didn't go well.
I'd heard that on some of the later Beatle albums that actually some of the drumming was either done by you or else you gave Ringo direction for it?
Very little. I gave him the what?
You gave him a sort of direction for it?
We always gave Ringo direction on every single number.
Really?
It's hardly ever a number when we just said, okay, play what you feel. Mainly, it was very controlled. Whoever had written the song, it was John, he'd say, I want this. And obviously a lot of stuff came out of what Ringo was playing anyway, but we would always control it. There would hardly ever be like a break where we all didn't look at that break and think, right, we don't want anything here.
Ringo later explained, Paul is the greatest bass guitarist in the world, but he is also very determined. He goes on and on to see if he can get his own way. Ken Scott remembered, I remember Ringo being uptight about something. I don't remember what. And the next thing I was told was that he'd quit the band. He took off for a vacation in Sardinia on Peter Sellers' yacht. Despite being down a drummer, the band pushed on, recording the basic backing track for Back in the USSR that night. Ken Scott recalled, Ringo's not here today kind of thing, so we just carried on as usual. Paul played the drums himself, while George played a sharp, choppy rhythm guitar to match the snare beats. John played bass, but instead of picking individual notes, he strummed it like a guitar. After 5 takes, they decided take 5 was the best and left it there for the night. Even though they tried to keep Ringo's departure quiet, word got out. Kenneth Womack's book, Living the Beatles Legend, tells the story of a drunk drummer showing up at EMI Studios, claiming, I've come to play with the Beatles, after hearing Ringo had quit. Mal, ever the problem solver, slowly walked the guy out of the building while assuring him, Ringo hasn't left the Beatles, he's just on holiday. Later that same day, on August 23rd, the 3 remaining Beatles returned to the studio to finish the track. According to the Beatles' recording sessions, Ringo's absence seemed to motivate them to create one of their tightest and best recorded rock songs ever. They overdubbed more parts onto take 5, including additional drum bits, probably played by all three of them. Paul added lead guitar, bass, and piano. John played rhythm guitar and even another drum part, while George contributed lead guitar and more bass. According to the Beatles' recording sessions, the song was also a composite recording in other ways, with 3 bass guitar parts played by John, Paul, and George respectively, and both Paul and George playing lead guitar. With the tape sped up slightly, Paul recorded his lead vocals, sometimes double-tracked, while he, John, and George laid down Beach Boys-style harmonies. They even threw in some hand claps. Paul later admitted in the lyrics, "There's a pretty blatant parody of a Beach Boys chorus in the background." Once all the overdubs were done, George Martin and his team made the mono mix, adding one last touch: the sound of a Viscount turboprop airliner taking off and landing. Engineer John Smith explained how they did it. "Someone managed to get that tape for me at London Airport. There's one of it revving up and taking off, and one of it landing. They looped the sounds and faded them in and out while mixing." John and Paul also wanted to do some songs on the White Album to crossfade into each other. During the Beatles' only 24-hour session, October 16th through 17th, they finalized the album's running order. Back in the USSR was crossfaded into Dear Prudence, and with that, Back in the USSR was officially complete. Despite claims that the White Album marked the Beatles' breakup, they seemed totally in sync on this opening track, a true potboiler. The instruments had the same energy and teamwork as their earlier albums, except Ringo wasn't there. The Beatles couldn't seem to avoid controversy during this period. From John's more popular than Jesus comment to Paul admitting he took LSD, and even their troubles in the Philippines, the list goes on. Adding to this was the reaction to Back in the USSR. Ian MacDonald's notes in Revolution in the Head that the song was recorded just as Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, making it an ill-timed joke. In the US, the John Birch Society accused the Beatles of spreading communism, while both the New Left and Far Right saw it as pro-Soviet. Meanwhile, in Russia, where the fans got their Beatles fix through smuggled tapes, the band was dismissed as the belch of Western culture. Paul was even denied permission to perform there in the 80s. But in 2003, he finally played Moscow's Red Square, performing Back in the USSR for an ecstatic crowd. Reflecting on the song's origins, he called Russia a mystical land back then, and was happy to finally experience it firsthand. After the show, he proudly declared, "We finally got to do that one here."
I think I was very lucky. As I say, when I hit this little humorous vein, it seemed to just sort of flow.
I don't think I ever understood at the time that BOAC was in the first line. I'm not sure if I ever quite understood what it was.
Yeah.
Now, does that horrify you?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm still finding things in these lyrics, but I do sometimes think, I mean, particularly about this one, how amazingly ancient all the ideas are now. There isn't a USSR. anymore. There isn't a BOAC. And I often wonder, like you didn't get it, I don't think the kids get it. I'm not sure they know what USSR was.
Yeah.
It's just a rock and roll song.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, the joke is that I then split it up. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR.
I felt two things. I felt I wasn't playing great, and the other three were really happy, and I was an outsider. And so, I came to this decision, I'm leaving, and I knew we were just in a messed up stage, all of us. Then, it wasn't just me, it was the whole thing was going down. And I came back and went in the studio, and George had it decked out with flowers. It's just flowers everywhere. And John had sent me telegrams saying, "You're the best rock drummer, come on home." and I just felt good about myself again. And we'd got through that little crisis.
That was lovely, Jeremy.
We've lost the sub for good. Or for bad. Or for worse.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
Dear Prudence is me.
Written in India, a song about Mia Farrow's sister, who went slightly balmy meditating too long and couldn't come out of the little hut that we were living in. And
so
they selected me and George to try and bring her out because she would trust us. She'd gone completely mental. If she'd been in the West, they would have put her away.
Did you have any other luck?
Well, we got her out of the house. She'd been locked in 3 weeks and wouldn't come out, trying to reach God quicker than anybody else. That was the competition in Maharishi's camp. Who was going to get cosmic first?
Away from drugs and Rishikesh, John's creativity was flowing, and he worked on new songs using his Martin acoustic guitar. That's when Dear Prudence came. Donovan remembers teaching him the famous finger-picking guitar style. Some afternoons, we would gather at one of our pads and play the acoustic guitars we had all brought with us. John was keen to learn the fingerstyle guitar I played, and he was a good student. John wrote Julia and Dear Prudence based on the picking I taught him. This style, likely influenced by folk musicians like Bert Jansch or Davy Graham, involved tuning the guitar's low E string down to D. It became a key part of Dear Prudence. Paul, however, recalls that Donovan's friend, Gypsy Dave, may have been the one who actually taught John this style. He learned to fingerpick off of Donovan or Gypsy Dave. I think John said it was Gypsy Dave, but the two of them were fairly inseparable, and they both would have known it. And if they were both sitting down picking, then who is to know? It was a folk picking style, and John was the only one in the band who could ever do that properly. Once you can do it, it's really very handy. It's a useful style. The song was inspired by Prudence Farrow, actress Mia Farrow's younger sister. She arrived at the retreat before the Beatles and was completely focused on meditation. In her book Dear Prudence, the story behind the song, she says, "I needed to find peace, true peace inside myself. I'd been meditating since 1966 and had tried to get on the course in 1967, so it was like a dream come true for me. Being on the course was much more important to me than anything in the world. I was very focused on getting in as much meditation as possible so that I could gain enough experience to teach it myself. I knew that I must have stuck out because I would always rush straight back to my room after lectures and meals so that I could meditate. It was all so fascinating to me. John, George, and Paul would all want to sit around jamming and having a good time, and I'd be flying into my room. The song that John wrote was just saying, 'Come out and play with us. Come out and have fun.' She got so deep into meditation that she stopped responding to people. Musician Paul Horn, who was there, remembers. She was ashen white and didn't recognize anybody. She didn't even recognize her own brother, who was on the course with her. The only person she showed any slight recognition towards was Maharishi. We were all very concerned about her, and Maharishi assigned her a full-time nurse. Since Prudence was staying in the same building as the Beatles, they noticed something was wrong. Paul added, "We all got a bit worried about her, so we went up there and knocked. 'Hi, Prudence. We all love you. You're wonderful.' But nobody could persuade her out." John later said, "They selected me and George to try to bring her out because she would trust us. We got her out of the house. She'd been locked in for 3 weeks and wouldn't come out. She was trying to find God quicker than anyone else. That was the competition in Maharishi's camp. Who was going to get cosmic first? What I didn't know was that I was already cosmic. But Prudence didn't actually hear Dear Prudence at the time. George was the one who told me about it, she said. At the end of the course, just as they were leaving, he mentioned that they had written a song about me, but I didn't hear it until it came out on the album. I was flattered. It was a beautiful thing to have done. Jenny Boyd, Patty Harrison's sister, shared more details in her book Jennifer Juniper. Mia's sister, Prudence, had a room in our block, opposite my room. One evening, after George and our young meditator friend, Richard, had been chatting with her, they noticed something was wrong. We know she'd been doing extensive meditations, non-stop, and wondered if she'd gone too far. One by one, we walked into Prudence's room, trying to bring her back to normal, but she continued to sit bolt upright, cross-legged on top of her bed and staring into oblivion. John went in with his guitar and played for her Dear Prudence. I went in with the flute I'd bought in San Francisco and made some sounds, but it was all to no avail. Prudence looked as though she was locked inside herself. Her condition got worse, and the following night she completely flipped out, shouting, throwing things around, and screaming. She was taken to Maharishi's bungalow, and from there was moved to Block 1, in the last row of the bungalows. A private nurse stayed with her around the clock, and in the doorway stood one of the guards. We heard later that her condition was probably more to do with the psychedelic drug she'd taken before becoming a meditator, but even so. After this incident, Maharishi advised us to take breaks in between long meditations. Despite the experience, Prudence stuck with meditation and became a certified teacher. The Beatles didn't start recording Dear Prudence until August 28th, 3 months after John wrote it in India. They had just finished Hey Jude at Trident Studios using 8-track equipment, since EMI Studios didn't have it yet, so they went back to Trident to record John's song the same way. Ringo was still away, so John, Paul, and George showed up at around 5 p.m. to get to work. Technically, they recorded just one take 1. But as Mark Lewison explains in the Beatles recording sessions, that doesn't tell the whole story. The 8-track facility meant that it could be recorded track by track, each one perfected over a number of times while simultaneously wiping previous attempts. This method of working makes the take 1 statistic look distinctly silly, for although it was just one take, it was innumerable recordings. Basically, they built the song layer by layer. John played his Epiphone Casino electric guitar using that signature finger-picking style. George added a distorted lead guitar part on his Gibson SG Standard, and Paul filled in on drums. The session didn't wrap up until 7 a.m. the next day, so they clearly spent a lot of time perfecting everything. And since Trident was a commercial studio, unlike EMI, which the Beatles basically had unlimited access to, EMI had to pay up. £431 in studio fees, engineer overtime, and blank tape. Later that same day, August 29th, they were back at Trident by 7 p.m. to add more layers. Paul recorded his bass part, while John played tambourine, and John also recorded his lead vocals, later double-tracking them manually. Then they brought in a small crew: Mal Evans, Paul's cousin John McCartney, and Apple artist Jackie Lomax, to join Paul, John, and George for backing vocals, tracks 1 and 2. At some point, they all clapped along, and Mal even added some tambourine. They also broke into applause at the end of the song, though that part got faded out in the final mix. The next evening, August 30th, on the same day that Hey Jude was released in the UK, they were back at Trident one last time to finish Dear Prudence. George recorded another guitar part, including a higher octave version of his previous riff in the last verse. Paul added some piano, and then because a flugelhorn happened to be lying around, he played a quick part on that during the bridge. By 11 p.m., the song was officially done. Dear Prudence came up again briefly on October 7th at EMI Studio 2, during a marathon session, mainly focused on George's Long, Long, Long. According to the Beatles' recording sessions, George was in a happy mood throughout, laughing, joking, and bursting into busked versions of other songs, including Dear Prudence. This was never officially released, but it's proof that the White Album sessions weren't just tension and fights like they're sometimes painted as. Dear Prudence uses a descending chromatic sequence akin to those of the verses of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Cry Baby Cry, whose childhood resonances it shares. The lyrics, John's gentlest, work on similar nursery rhyme principles. John must have known that he had something of great potential with Dear Prudence, insisting on recording it at Trident Studios with their 8-track capabilities in order to inspire them to a perfect arrangement and performance. All three Beatles were at their best, John's excellently performed and newly perfected guitar chops being put to good use. Dear Prudence is one of the Beatles' most mesmerizing and underrated tracks, a song that blends intricate musicianship with a hypnotic, almost dreamlike atmosphere. From John's delicate fingerpicking to Paul's powerful bass and drumming and John's soaring guitar work, it's a testament to their ability to turn a simple moment into something timeless.
We're just in it as drawings, and it's like us animated goes through it, you know.
But did Mystery Tour put you off making a film completely yourselves?
Yeah, we're only ever going to be cartoons forever now, because they really put us off those.
It's a new career piece.
No good damn critics.
The film makes, the cartoon makes a bit of fun of the Maharishi. Does this mean that you've finished with him now? He's
Well,
a
it's
figure of fun.
not finished with, you know, but we're over that phase. It was a bit of a phase. But he's still a nice fella, and everybody's fine.
The Beatles were not too keen about participating in a new motion picture. A Hard Day's Night was a smash hit for critics and audiences, but Help was described by John as just bullshit, and Magical Mystery Tour was tarnished by critics after its premiere on the BBC. The last thing the boys wanted to do was another movie, but they still had to honor their commitment with United Artists for a third film, so they saw an animated film as a favorable way to just get it over with.
Actually, the thing that I liked most about the movie was we didn't really have to do anything to do it. They just took the music, we met with them, they talked about basically what they were going to do.
In fact, the original idea of a Beatles animated film was simply an extended version of one of the Beatles TV cartoon series, which explains why the filmmakers were given 11 months to deliver a feature with a budget of less than $300,000. This was a fraction of what Disney, the only company producing animated features at that time, spent in terms of time and money on one of its films. Although it was popular and produced by his studio, director George Dunning thought the series had a very poor kind of design and decided to ignore the wishes of the film's producer and tried to attempt something genuinely creative. Dunning's work on the film is limited to the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds sequence, which he created with animator Bill Sewell, but his most important contribution was the decision to go beyond what was expected and then hire the team who could achieve it.
I thought from the very beginning this should be a series of interconnected shorts, so the style should vary every 5 minutes or so to keep the interest going until the end.
One of these men was the film's art director, Heinz Edelmann, a Czech expatriate who was working as a graphic designer and illustrator in Dusseldorf. It was the first time he had worked on a film. Edelmann's lack of experience may have turned out to be an advantage, as it forced the animators working from his designs and model sheets to be innovative. One of the key animators, Michael Stewart, noted that Edelmann's line of drawing was totally different to anything that had been done in animation before. His two-dimensional flat designs ended up being animated in a sort of mix between three-dimensional and two-dimensional, and a mix of techniques that was used to incorporate his ideas. Among the things Edelmann was specifically responsible for creating were the Beatles figures, the Yellow Submarine, Pepperland, the Blue Meanies, the Flying Glove, and almost all the bizarre monsters and characters. At that time, he says, he was heavily into monsters, and it shows. A third major figure in creating the film was special sequences director Charlie Jenkins, who was an expert at mixing animation media and was responsible for the Eleanor Rigby sequence. It was Jenkins who devised a method of changing the perspective during that sequence, rotating the camera table to 90 degrees and moving the foreground down and the background up by turning the peg bar handles. The low budget and tight timetable created a chaotic atmosphere during its creation. Much of the animation was done before there was even a script, and Lee Meinhof, credited with writing the original story, has acknowledged that the film was drawn more than it was written. The musical director, some guy you might have heard of called George Martin, was given sketches and storyboards to start with, and then reels of film as they were finished, but was given no other directions for his scoring or orchestration except, be as imaginative as you can. Really, it's a miracle that the film turned out as good as it did. This chaos may have turned out to be an advantage, though, because it allowed a number of artists to work with an unusual level of freedom and an even more unusual diversity of styles. It was really lightning in a bottle situation. The Blue Meanies, of course, have ear-shaped hats very similar to those of a very famous cartoon character that Edelmann was not a fan of. The head meanie and his sidekick Max were drawn to resemble the producers, Al Brodax and Abe Goodman, who had wanted a cheap cartoon along the lines of the TV series and reluctantly went along with the film's experimentation. As they were also both Jewish, this is a source of the "you don't look bluish" joke.
Are you, bluish? You don't look bluish.
There are a blizzard of references in the film, ranging from the obvious to the obscure, and probably touching any given point in between. A frequently referenced source is the surrealist painter René Magritte, who died in June 1967, at about the time that work on the film was beginning. There was already a connection between Magritte and the Beatles. Magritte's 1966 painting, Le Jeu de Mort, a picture of a green apple with au revoir written across it, was the inspiration for the iconic logo of the Beatles' company Apple Corps. Another prominent appropriation from Magritte was from his Golconda, which depicts a group of men wearing identical dark overcoats and bowler hats, who may be floating over a cityscape or are possibly raining down on an anonymous city. This image was the clear inspiration for the film's host of bowler-hatted umbrella men lurking on Liverpool's rooftops.
Well, you know, the problem was the only material I had to work with were the photographs on the record sleeves. And so it was mostly how I felt they were as people than closely following photographs or abstracting from photographs.
As much as you can capture people's characters in a cartoon drawing, an animation piece, I think they did pretty well, really.
Hola, that's all. What's the matter, fellas? Blue meanies.
Since the Beatles were too busy with other projects, actors were hired to dub in the voices of the animated Beatles.
We didn't imitate their voices. We tried to recreate what we thought were their voices.
John? Paul? George? Is anybody home?
Where are we? The thing is that none of the Beatles liked their own voices that had been done by us. I mean, Ringo said, I don't really like the voice, I don't really like it, I mean, the others like it, but I don't. And they all feel the same about their voices.
Robert R. Hieronymus argues that the 1960s are defined by the pop art nouveau look as much as they created it, and that designers around the world were picking up the same vibe and adapting it their own way. Edelman's version of this vibe was a deliberate attempt at a psychedelic experience. As he said, "I did try to consciously overload the audience with impressions. There is always a bit more color than one would expect, and a bit more design." The most spectacular of the song sequences is the animation of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. George Dunning, its principal creator, describes the scene as a musical number. That is, a Beatles song transformed into a dance number. But not just any dance number, but an elaborate tribute to 1930s Hollywood musicals, featuring a series of rotoscoped dancers, including Eddie Cantor, Fred Astaire, and Ginger Rogers, Ruby Keeler, and chorus girls out of a Busby Berkeley-type musical.
The Yellow Submarine script had gone through several drafts and the movie was already in production, when producer Al Brodax contacted Eric Siegel, the author of Love Story, who was at the time an assistant professor at Yale.
The phone rang, and it was Al Brodax from London. He said, "Siegel, this is Big Al Brodax. I'm going to give you the chance of a lifetime." I said, "What?" He said, "I need a rewrite fast. I need a rewrite in 3 weeks. Are you going to come?" I said, "I don't know if I want to come. I mean, I hear this picture's a cartoon. I don't want to write cartoons." He said, "Siegel, don't you understand? Sgt. Pepper has already sold 3 million albums." I didn't know who Sgt. Pepper was, so I said, "Mrs. Pepper must be very happy."
An uncredited writer responsible for much of the Beatles' dialogue in the movie is Roger McGough, a Liverpool poet and former member of the pop group The Scaffold, which coincidentally also included Paul McCartney's brother Michael.
When I saw the script, I could see why, in fact, I'd been brought in. It read as if it were set on the Bronx or something. I mean, the Beatles actually spoke sort of American Jewish. So it wasn't so much that it wasn't funny, it wasn't anything, but it was not Liverpudlian. That's all it was, I thought. So I was brought in as a Liverpudlian, as a writer.
Yes, they do look very nice, don't they?
Yes, they do. They do, though, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Don't they, though?
Do?
It's the rhythm. It's the rhythm. The way they cut together, and the flat voice of Ringo and Paul's this one. There's certain words you use in the sing-song and the elements of which, I suppose, as a poet, I was able to help.
Liverpool can be a lonely place on a Saturday night. And this is only Thursday morning.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney would sometimes call up producer Al Brodax with script suggestions. One morning at 3 a.m., John called and said, "Wouldn't it be great if Ringo was followed down the street by a yellow submarine?" And the suggestion made it into the script.
The Beatles considered the cartoon TV series a ripoff, and so wanted nothing to do with a feature that was anything like it. However, just because they were not physically present, it does not follow that they had no creative influence, as their spirit runs through the film. To understand the effect the Beatles had on the film, it is necessary to understand the place they held in the popular culture of the time. The best example is shown in the film sequence, when the Beatles' music brings the Pepperlanders out of suspended animation, changing them from monochrome grays to vivid rainbows. Their 1964 appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show is held as being like the moment in The Wizard of Oz when the world changes from black and white to color. Stanley Kaufman wrote in his review of the film that, "I don't know how I knew what a Beatles animated film ought to look like, but the moment Yellow Submarine began, I knew Edelman and company were exactly right." Yellow Submarine was a unique film for its time. Unlike the Disney-dominated scene, it broke away from the usual realistic style and typical show tunes, instead featuring a vibrant mix of colors and rock and roll music by the world's most famous band. Although it was taken seriously by critics and seen as more for adults, it was only a moderate success at first, earning less than $1 million in the US, compared to Disney's The Jungle Book, which made $11.5 million. However, Yellow Submarine quickly gained a strong cult following, even among those who didn't need LSD to enjoy it. Scene by scene, Yellow Submarine wasn't groundbreaking. Most of the styles and techniques had been done before in experimental animation. But what made it innovative was how it combined all these elements into one film. Critic John Simon noted that the film's successes came from how it mixed genres effortlessly, like a well-tossed salad without trying too hard. No wonder 1968 audiences felt like they might have taken too much acid while watching it. John Lasseter, Pixar's co-founder, credited the film with sparking a wider interest in animation as a serious art form, at a time when it was mostly seen as just for kids. Even 50 years later, Yellow Submarine remains a landmark in animation history. In some ways, the Yellow Submarine project is the opposite of the Magical Mystery Tour. While Magical Mystery Tour was criticized for being pretentious and confusing, and it relied heavily on the Beatles' filmmaking talents, or lack thereof, Yellow Submarine was well received. While the music from Magical Mystery Tour was top-notch, the Yellow Submarine soundtrack feels like it was made by a super talented group that just couldn't be bothered. Of course, this was at a time when the Beatles were making some of the best pop albums ever, so good enough is a matter of perspective.
H for hurry, E for urgent, L for love me, and P for please, help.
It's a game.
We're playing those games together.
I have something in common with both of you. I met the guru, the Maharishi, and I noticed that he went out with an act, the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
And it folded.
Right.
Would the Beatles go out with the yogi as an act?
Well, we've found out that we made a mistake there. So we
Terrible
believe
idea.
in meditation, but not the Maharishi and his scene. We're finished with that bit.
Puisqu'on n'y peut rien. C'est tout à fait naturel, enfin c'est un...
Ça arrive à tout le monde. On est très jeune, on grandit, on vieillit, on meurt. C'est pour ça que je vais m'engager parce que...
I heard you. I heard her. You heard her? He heard her.
When the Beatles hit the US stage for the first time on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964, all eyes and ears were on their fresh and exciting sound. Nobody in the screaming crowd that night was really paying attention to the lyrics. If you watch the performance today, you'll see what I mean. When Paul sang, "Close your eyes and I'll kiss you, tomorrow I'll miss you," nobody was overanalyzing the words. It just meant what it meant. But fast forward a couple of years and things changed. Those same fans might have been scratching their heads trying to figure out what Beatle lyrics like "turn off your mind, relax and float downstream" really meant. Before long, they were wondering about Marmalade Skies, Yellow Matter Custard, and where exactly Strawberry Fields was. And who was the fool on the hill anyway? If you listened closely, maybe you'd find the answers hidden in the songs. For the fans who loved digging into Beatles lyrics for clues, the White Album gave them something new to obsess over. Track 3, Glass Onion, seemed like it might finally reveal some missing pieces. Or did it? Listening to the song, it's pretty clear that John wanted people to think they were connecting the dots. I was having a laugh because there'd been so much gobbledygook about Pepper, play it backwards, stand on your head, and all that, John said in 1970. He wasn't actually giving fans real clues. He was just messing with them, just like he had done before with I Am the Walrus. Paul says, he and Yoko came round to Cavendish Avenue, and John and I went out into the garden for half an hour, because there were a couple of things he needed me to finish up, but it was his song, his idea. It was a nice song of John's. We had a fun moment when we were working on the bit, "I've got news for you all, the walrus was Paul," because although we'd never planned it, people read into our songs and little legends grew up about every item of so-called significance, so on this occasion we decided to plant one. What John meant was that in the Magical Mystery Tour, when we came to do the costumes on I Am the Walrus, it happened to be me in the walrus costume. It was not significant at all, but it was a nice little twist to the legend that we threw in. But it was John's song. I'd guess I'd had a minor input or something as we finished it up together. We still worked together, even on a song like Glass Onion, where many people think there wouldn't be any collaboration.
Glass Onion?
That's me just doing a throwaway song, you know, a la Walrus, a la everything I've ever written.
Which you,
I'm throwing the line in, the Walrus was Paul, just to confuse everybody a bit more, and because I felt slightly guilty because I'd got Yoko and he got nothing, and I was going to quit.
Bungalow
and so I thought, Walrus has now become meaning I am the one.
Right.
And he didn't mean that in the song originally, he just meant it could have been I'm the fox terrier, you know, I mean, it's just a bit of poetry. So it was just thrown in like that.
John explained further in 1970. At that time, I was still in my love cloud with Yoko. I thought, well, I'll just say something nice to Paul, that it's all right and you did a good job over these few years, holding us together. He was trying to organize the group and all that, so I wanted to say something to him. I thought, well, he can have it. I've got Yoko. And thank you, you can have the credit. The Beatles began recording Glass Onion on September 11th. They recorded 34 takes of the rhythm track, with John on acoustic guitar and guide vocals, George on Stratocaster, Paul on Fender jazz bass, and Ringo on drums. Most takes were about 1:50 long, though take 15 extended into a 6-minute jam. Take 33 was the best of the day. But John felt that the recording of Glass Onion still needed something, so he compiled sound effects of 4 different elements at home and brought them into the control room of EMI Studio 2 on September 26th for overdubbing onto the track. A 4-track tape was created for the purpose of this overdub. Track 1 contained a telephone ringing, Track 2 contained a single note of an organ, Track 3 contained BBC television soccer commentator Kenneth Wolstenholme shouting, "It's a goal!" over and over with a cheering crowd in the background, and Track 4 contained the sound of a window being smashed.
It's a goal! It's a goal! It's a goal! It's a goal!
All 4 tracks had these elements repeated over and over, similar to what we saw in Revolution 9. After this 4-track tape was put together, 2 attempts at a mono mix were made by Chris Thomas and engineers Ken Scott and Mike Sheedy, no doubt with input from John, interjecting these effects at different times during the mix. Upon George Martin's return from vacation, he was played mixes of 5 of the Beatles songs that were recorded in his absence, Glass Onion being one of them. He was unimpressed by John's sound effects, though, and convinced him to let him score a part for strings to complement the song nicely. John relented, and the tape box containing Glass Onion with the strange sound effects was marked "Do Not Use," which of course was readily noticed when compiling the Anthology 3 album. With the allotted time for finishing the album coming to a close, the needed session to record the string arrangement for Glass Onion happened on October 10th. 8 musicians were brought in for the overdub on the song, as well as on George's Piggies. An eerie orchestral score was recorded as an edit piece for the conclusion of Glass Onion, which slowed in tempo as it progressed. It seems that, paired with A Beginning, George Martin was really into weird, experimental pieces intercutting with the Beatles songs, which really complemented the recordings. I can't imagine Glass Onion without those strings. Glass Onion was packed with nods to other Beatles songs, including Strawberry Fields, I Am the Walrus, Lady Madonna, The Fool on the Hill, and Fixing a Hole. The phrase Glass Onion itself might just be a metaphor for overanalyzing things that don't actually have a deeper meaning. As David Quantick put it in his book, Revolution, The Making of the Beatles' White Album, peel away the layers of an onion, and there is, of course, nothing there. But with a glass onion, you don't even have to peel. The essential nothingness of it is on display for all to see. So, in the end, Glass Onion was John's way of having a bit of fun with the fans who were always searching for hidden meanings in Beatles lyrics. But did it actually reveal anything? Well, that's for you to decide. But the answer is no.
Well, some DJ said last night they played some Beatles stuff on the radio. I just was going across the dial and then suddenly I heard something or other. Green Onion, Glass Onion. See, I don't even know my own songs. So I listened to it because it was a rare track. They don't usually play it. They usually play the same 10 when they say there's going to be a Beatle weekend. You know, it's the same 10, Hard Day's Night, Help, Yesterday, Something, Let It Be. You know, there's all that wealth of material, but we only ever hear 10 songs. And he said, I want to thank John, Paul, George and Ringo for not getting back together again and spoiling the good thing.
Shh, keep the voice down. You know what I found? It's the uniforms. Nice bit of gear, that.
Moving away from the complexity of songs seen on Sgt. Pepper, Paul decides to harken back to some of the Beatles' mid-60s signature sound with I Will, which sounds quite similar to what they were doing in Help, for example. Though this track is a very simple, laid-back sound, it took a whopping 67 takes to get it done, in true McCartney fashion, though many of the takes were false starts. I had the melody for quite a long time, but I didn't have lyrics to it, Paul said. I remember sitting around with Donovan after our day of meditation, and I played him I Will, and he liked it, and we were trying to write some words. We kicked around a few lyrics, something about the moon, but they weren't very satisfactory. And I thought the melody was better than the words, so I didn't use them. I kept searching for better words, and I wrote down my own set in the end. Very simple words. I think they're quite effective. It's still one of my favorite melodies that I've written. Since Paul said he had the melody for a long time, and there were no straightforward love ballads on Pepper or Magical Mystery Tour, one could suppose he had the tune since 1966 or before. As for the credits, it's safe to say that Paul wrote it all. On January 13th, 1969, when he was being interviewed during the Get Back sessions, we can see him saying, "It's like, we were trying to get the last verse to I Will, and eventually I just ended up doing it, because we couldn't actually do it," referring to his and John's lack of collaboration in recent times. We can infer from this phrase that Paul asked John for help in writing the words for the last section of I Will, but John didn't cooperate, so Paul wrote the lyrics by himself. As for who it is for, Paul reveals, "Just because I was involved with Jane Asher at the time doesn't mean the song is about Jane. When I'm writing, it's as if I'm setting words and music to the film I'm watching in my head. It's a declaration of love, yes, but not always to someone specific. So this is me in my troubadour mode." At the time, Paul was influenced by Brazilian bossa nova, in the likes of Tom Jobim or João Gilberto, trying to mimic that Latin American mambo and rumba feeling. Paul played acoustic guitar and added a sung bass part on it, and softened his already sweet lead vocal with automatic double tracking, a recording technique designed to enhance the sound of voices or instruments during the mixing process. George didn't take part in the recording, and John and Ringo added percussion, maracas, bongos, and cymbals. The one and only Beatles performance of I Will was recorded in George's Friar Park home on June 23, 1994, with Paul and George playing ukuleles and Ringo present. They performed this quick run-through while reminiscing on songs they had composed while in Rishikesh, India, but Paul played the song solo many times. I Will, despite its short length and bare production, was a catchy sing-along that brought back the Beatles' earlier sound, and it gave us good cover versions, such as Peter Serafinovich's one. The song endures and blends in well with the Beatles' and Paul's extensive catalog of timeless love ballads. I Will proves that no one can write a love song as effortlessly as Paul McCartney.
Hi, I'm Paul McCartney. They say it's your birthday.
Most people know that the Beatles wrote most of the White Album songs while in India, but some were written before, like Piggies, and some after, like Martha My Dear. One song on the album was completely unique. It was written and recorded on the same day. Usually, the Beatles came into the studio with at least a partially written song. They might tweak lyrics or change things while recording, but they never created a song from scratch and finished it in one session. The closest they had come before was 12-bar original in '65, but that never really went anywhere. On September 18th, Paul showed up early to EMI Studio 2 and started playing around on the piano. They planned to record another song that day, but Paul had an idea, so they did it. Why did they start earlier than usual? Chris Thomas, who was filling in as producer, explained. I had mentioned to Paul a couple of days earlier about The Girl Can't Help It being on television during this evening. This 1956 rock and roll movie was a big deal to the Beatles when they first saw it in 1957. It featured performances by their heroes like Eddie Cochran, whose song 20 Flight Rock Paul played when he first met John. The movie was finally airing on British TV for the first time, and since there were no recordings back then, they didn't want to miss it. So they planned to start early, record a song, watch the movie at Paul's house, and then return to finish the track. Paul was the first one in, and he was playing the birthday riff. Eventually, the others arrived, by which time Paul had literally written the song right there in the studio. We had the backing track down by about 8:30, popped around to watch the film, and then came back and actually finished the whole song. It was all done in a day. Paul later explained that the song's riff was inspired by classic rock songs. We often started a session with a riff, and for us, the riff of riffs was Little Richard's Lucille. It's the riff Roy Orbison adapted for Pretty Woman, so we did the same thing for Birthday. All very basic stuff. Talking about how the song came together, Paul said, "The film The Girl Can't Help It was on television, an old rock film. Fats Domino, Gene Vincent, and Eddie Cochran were in it, and we wanted to see it. So we started at 5 o'clock and just did a backing track, a very simple 12-bar blues thing with a few bits here and there. We had no idea what it was going to be or what was going to go on top of it. We'd just say 12 bars in A, then change to D, then do a few beats in C. And then we really just did it like that. A random thing. We didn't have time for anything else. Then we went back to my house, watched the film, and then we went back to the studio and made up some words to go with it all, which were, they say it's your birthday, well, it's my birthday too, yay. And this song was just made up in an evening. We hadn't ever thought of it before then. It's one of my favorites because it was instantaneous. And also it's a good one to dance to. Even though the Beatles had stopped touring, Paul was clearly thinking about live performances again. Birthday is one of those songs that was written to be played in a live show, with a view to being performed, because there's always someone who's got a birthday. Some of my songs have functions above and beyond merely getting themselves into the world. Two of the lines I'd focus on are, I would like you to dance, take a cha-cha-cha chance. I'm reminded that another band that was very much to the fore then was The Who. They had a very memorable moment in my generation, which involved what we used to call a stammer or a stutter on the phrase fade away. But when you go fade on live British television, that gets people's attention. I remember that moment quite vividly, and that impediment, let's call it, informed the cha-cha-cha in Birthday, just as Birthday informed the cha-cha-cha in David Bowie's Changes. Being a songwriter is about picking up the baton and holding it for a while, and then passing it on. John said in a 1972 interview that Birthday was written by both him and Paul, but in 1980, he downplayed his role, saying,
Birthday was written in the studio, just made up on the spot. I think Paul wanted to write a song about birthday, probably because of Happy Birthday Baby, the old 50s hit, but whatever, and it was sort of made up in the studio. A piece of garbage.
It's my birthday too. I never quite understood
It's garbage, yeah. But one interesting thing is the sound. We put the piano through an amplifier, a guitar amplifier, and put the tremolo on it, and that's the most memorable thing about that. It might have been the first time that happened.
Even though John went on to call the track a piece of garbage. It seems quite obvious from listening to and examining this track that everybody involved in creating and recording Birthday on this day, John included, really enjoyed themselves. Enthusiasm was running high, and everyone put away the beefs they had with each other and let it rip, creating heavy metal Beatles that was sure to please 50s rock enthusiasts, as well as headbangers for generations to come.
a lot of the recordings where they would have a basic idea and then they would have a jam session to end it, which sometimes didn't sound too good.
What are the Beatles?
Kids. Little kids, yeah, they were little kids. I want to hold your hand, you know, yeah, well, they still want to hold my hand, you know, still, they ain't nothing changed. They get older, we get older, you know, I mean, but they're just kids as far as I'm concerned. McCartney, or whatever his name is, don't know what he's doing. He's up there making music with people that's creating babies all across the country, that he's the father of all kinds of things that he doesn't even have the brains to realize, you know. You don't lay with that snake, or the snake is going to eat you sooner or later, you know. Then you look down the street and you wonder why your children are all wondering, you know, all kinds of different ways and things of doing all kinds of stuff.
That's why all that Manson stuff was built around George's song about pigs,
right,
and Paul's song about an English fairground.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with anything, and least of all to do with me.
Yeah.
I gave George a couple of lines about forks and knives and eating bacon.
Which one is that? Which song is
on
that?
Piggies or whatever, that famous
Little Piggies
depression song that he wrote.
As the Beatles grew, their music reflected what was happening in their lives. George, for example, went through a cynical phase in '66, calling out the government in Taxman, and authority in Love You Too, with lines like, "There's people standing round who'll screw you in the ground." Then he started focusing on philosophy and devotion, and his sharp, critical tone disappeared. So why did Piggies, a biting political song, come from George in 1968? Wasn't he all about peace and spirituality by then? Did the Maharishi influence this shift? Wouldn't Piggies have fit better on Revolver instead of the White Album? George himself can answer these questions. That one I wrote about 2.5 or 3 years ago, but I never finished it. I had put the lyrics in a book at home, and I had completely forgotten about it until last summer when I dug them out. So it can be established that Piggies was indeed mostly written in '66, sometime near the time that he had composed the equally biting Taxman. In 1980, George continued, "Piggies is a social comment. I was stuck on one line in the middle until my mother came up with the lyric, 'What they need's a damn good whacking.' It needed to rhyme with backing and lacking." George warmly credits his mother, Louise Harrison, for this line to complete the song. He elicited her help, no doubt, at the time he discovered the original lyrics at his parents' house. George also added another verse to the song in '68, consisting of the lyrics, "Everywhere there's lots of piggies playing piggy pranks. You can see them on their trotters at the piggy banks, paying piggy thanks to thee, pig brother." George Orwell's work heavily influenced the lyrics of Piggies, particularly his 1945 novel Animal Farm, which used political allegory. The book's famous line, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," echoes themes George explored in the song. Additionally, the unused lyric "Pig Brother" was a clear nod to Orwell's 1984, a connection George even mentioned on The Dick Cavett Show in 1971. However, he left this verse out when recording the song, instead debuting it live in Japan in December 1991. John contributed a few lines, recalling in 1980, George seemed unsure about the bacon reference, awkwardly changing it to clutching forks and knives to cut their pork chops. David Quantick in Revolution, the making of the Beatles' White Album, interprets the song as a critique of class divisions. Little piggies struggling in the dirt, while big piggies live lavishly and stir up the dirt. Although pig was a common insult for police at the time, George clarified that the song was not about law enforcement, but rather the wealthy and powerful, who ignore the struggles of the lower class. As for Charles Manson's disturbing interpretation, George dismissed it entirely in a 1980 interview, calling it Californian shag nasties. On September 19, 1968, George brought Piggies into EMI Studios, making it the third of 5 songs he contributed to the White Album. The Beatles began recording at 7:15 p.m., with Paul on bass, Ringo on tambourine and kick drum, George on acoustic guitar, and his guide vocal. John did not participate in this session. While exploring Studio One, Chris Thomas discovered a harpsichord, originally set up for classical recording. Unable to move the instrument, the group relocated their session to Studio One. Thomas, who had studied at the Royal Academy of Music, played the harpsichord on Piggies, and during the session, George played him a new little song called Something. Thomas encouraged him to record it, but George initially considered giving it to Jackie Lomax. Thank God that didn't happen. After moving to Studio 1, they recorded take 11 to finalize the rhythm track. Thomas recalled struggling with timing on the harpsichord, leading the band to overdub his part. Thomas remembers, "I started playing on the backing track, and I couldn't keep time. It was really difficult. I wasn't a good people player. I hadn't practiced. I hadn't played for years, so it was pretty ropey." So they overdubbed it. They said, "Play a solo," so I sort of wrote a solo. I'd written a little kind of Bach-inspired thing when I was a kid, which I called the Minute Sonata, after the Minute Waltz. It did actually last a minute, the first, second, and third movements. That's why I was sort of used to fiddling around playing. The harpsichord now replaced George's guide vocal on track 4 of the 4-track tape, the Beatles undoubtedly now being familiar with the song enough to not need his vocal guidance. During this session, Paul also played early versions of Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road. Although other McCartney compositions were yet to be recorded for the White Album at this point, Paul decided to wait another 3.5 months before he readied these songs for the studio. The next evening, September 20th, they returned to Studio 2 for overdubs. They transferred Take 11 to an 8-track tape, renaming it to Take 12. George recorded and double-tracked his lead vocals, requesting something unique for the vocals in the bridge of the song, this being a nasal sound as if he was pinching his nose. Ken Townsend relates, "We fed the microphone signal through a very sharp echo chamber filter, an RS-106, so that it chopped off everything above and below the 3.5 kHz level, creating a very narrow band of sound. He, Paul, and John added harmonies, with John singing 2 octaves below. As you may have noticed, John hadn't been involved in the recording of the song very much. He found a very interesting way of contributing to the track, though. He busied himself in the control room of EMI Studio 2, compiling snorting pig sound effects and having them recorded onto a tape loop for inserting onto the recording. He was very familiar with this process, having done similar extensive work in compiling sound effects for Revolution 9 back in June. With George Martin back in the producer chair, he did what he did best, arranging and recording a classical string section to put a final touch on Piggies. Some critics and authors see Piggies as a step back in George's songwriting, but plenty of fans like it. The song's Baroque harpsichord, string arrangement, over-the-top vocals, and pig noises make it clear that it was not meant to be taken too seriously. While the lyrics have a dark, biting edge, the Beatles' signature sense of humor, like in their Christmas messages, shines through here.
The idea of the happiness of the warm gun thing is from an advert in an American paper.
Well, it said, happiness is a warm gun sort of thing, and it was sort of get ready for the long hot summer with a rifle, come and buy them now. It was an advert in a gun magazine, and it was so sick, the idea of come and buy your killing weapons and come and get it. And it was just such a great line, that happiness is a warm gun, that John sort of took that and uses that as a chorus. Yeah. And the rest of the words, I think they're great words, It's a poem. It's a poem, and it finishes off, happiness is a warm gun. Yes, it is.
So, in fact, he's probably fairly serious about...
Well, it's as serious as anyone ever gets, It's not deadly serious. It's just words, and if you sort of really taxed him on it and said, would you be willing to die for these words? I'm sure he wouldn't. I'm sure it's not really serious. But, the good words... I'd stick up for anyone who's sort of worried about him. It's just good poetry.
The White Album was the most stressful album the Beatles ever made. There were fights, shouting, and lots of bad vibes. Still, it wasn't all bad. One standout was the recording of Happiness is a Warm Gun. All 4 Beatles liked the song, and Paul even called it the best on the album. It appears that the bulk of the song was written after John had returned home from India. The finished song can be divided up into 3 distinct parts, the second of which was the first to be formulated by John and previewed to the band during their Esher demos phase. This part comprises the I Need a Fix, Mother Superior section of the song. This was all he had at that time. According to the demo recording, the song initially included a small section that contained the lyric, Yoko Ono, oh no, Yoko Ono, oh yes, which was eventually dropped.
Mother Superior was you. She was rabbiting on in the car one day, as is her wont. And I was saying, Mother Superior jumped the gun again, 'cause she's always one jump ahead. So that was Yoko, really, that little section. And they're all separate songs, I was telling you that.
Although John would usually deny that Happiness is a Warm Gun had any drug connotations, his I Need a Fix segment of the song suggests otherwise, and as Paul confirmed earlier, John was going through heavier drugs than the other 3 by this time. The next part of the song that was written was the final section, which was based on something that John had seen in print.
Anyway, Happiness is a Warm Gun, as I've said many, many times, was from the cover of a gun magazine which George Martin had in the studio when we were making a double album. Oh yeah. And it had Happiness is a Warm Gun on the cover, and on the cover it had a picture of a gun that had just been shot, was smoking, Yeah. And I thought, how incredible the fact that happiness is a warm gun that's just shot something or somebody. And that's why I wrote the song. The first half that's good, she's not a girl who misses much, was something I was writing vaguely connected with Yoko. It was just when I was first meeting her. And these are all different segments of songs, and I just wove them all together, different songs. Stuck them all in one piece and made like a little miniature
collage. It was.
Collage, like instead of an album collage like Pepper, this was all done in the one song. And it went through the different styles of rock, and it also was about a gun, not about heroin or anything. And those days I had no idea about heroin. I'd never seen it, knew anybody that had ever touched it or taken it.
The magazine in question was the May 1968 edition of American Rifleman. The phrase in the magazine was actually a humorous but dark takeoff of the Peanuts cartoon phrase, happiness is a warm puppy. The irony in John's choice of subject matter didn't escape many people's notice as the end of 1980 came around, especially not Paul's. I was thinking the other day about how poignant it was that John, who was shot in such tragic circumstances, should have written this song. As for other lyrics used in this section of the song, John relates, "It was at the beginning of my relationship with Yoko, and I was very sexually oriented then. When we weren't in the studio, we were in bed. These sexual thoughts resulted in the lines, when I hold you in my arms, and I feel my finger on your trigger. Continuing the 50s pastiche of this section of the song, John recalls,
That was very beautiful.
I don't think it's the first time we'd done it, but,
No,
it's
but,
one that,
yeah.
it was definitely a collage, yeah. And it was camp, that bit at the end. Shoot, shoot, bang, bang, and all that. Wasn't like the guy was saying, it's like, instead of shoot, shoot, do-ah, do-ah. The fact that it was about a gun, we said shoot, shoot, and bang, bang instead. And we were cracking up when I was doing all that. When I hold you in my arms, all that bit. Very funny.
The first section of this song was actually written last. According to Steve Turner's A Hard Day's Write, it came together during a night of acid tripping with John, Derek Taylor, Neil Aspinall, and Pete Shotton at a house Derek was renting from Peter Asher. Derek recalled that John had half a song written and asked them to throw out phrases while Neil wrote them down. John wanted a way to describe a smart girl, and Derek suggested, "She's not a girl who misses much," a phrase his father used. While Derek remembered coming up with it, John later claimed he wrote it himself, saying it was vaguely connected to Yoko after they first met. Derek also shared the inspiration behind other lyrics. The line about the touch of the velvet hand came from a man he met in a bar who said he wore moleskin gloves for a unique sensation with his girlfriend, like a lizard on a window pane, was inspired by quick-moving lizards he often saw in LA. The man in the crowd with the multicolored mirrors on his hobnailed boots was based on a newspaper story about a Manchester City fan arrested for putting mirrors on his shoes to look up girls' skirts. The line about lying with his eyes while his hands were busy working overtime referenced a thief who wore fake plastic hands while stealing under his cloak. As for the soap impression of his wife, Derek wasn't sure where that came from, but the part about donating it to the National Trust stemmed from conversations about people defecating in public spaces around Merseyside. The National Trust maintained scenic countryside, so the phrase was a poetic way of describing public defecation. When John pieced it all together, the lyrics became a surreal mix of layered images, almost like a chaotic, colorful painting. Paul relinquishes all authorship to John, not taking any credit for this Lennon-McCartney collaboration. Arguably, maybe it should be considered more of a Lennon-Taylor song. With just 3 weeks left before the White Album deadline, John had finished writing Happiness is a Warm Gun in Your Hand, its original title, and had brought it to the studio on September 23rd. First, they learned the song, then began working out the arrangement. After throwing around some ideas, they recorded 45 takes. Chris Thomas recalled, "Happiness is a Warm Gun went to a great many takes. We used to make jokes out of it. Take 83. After take 10, they switched to a second reel of tape and decided to add a Beatles break before the Mother Superior section to help with timing. The next evening, September 24th, they returned for another shot. They recorded 25 more takes, using the same instrumentation. Take 53 was solid, and take 65 was also deemed usable. But John had a problem. "Now I'm playing on a blister," he complained. "When it bursts, I won't be able to play anymore." Still, they pushed on. After take 67, he dramatically pleaded, "Please, God, may my blister last so I may pick abundance with." By take 70, his blister had likely burst, so they decided to splice the first 1 minute 34 seconds of take 53 with the final section of take 65.
Self-impression of his wife, which he ate and donated to the National Trust.
The session ended at 5 a.m., with John, Paul, and George all agreeing this was their favorite track on the White Album, and Paul was eager to play it for his new girlfriend, Linda Eastman, who had just moved in with him. Happiness is a Warm Gun is one of the most structurally unique Beatles songs. Aside from Revolution 9, it's one of only 2 without any repeating sections. The only other similar track is You Never Give Me Your Money from Abbey Road, which also stitches together different song ideas. The song constantly shifts between time signatures, with John adding beats wherever he felt like it. His claim that it represents the history of rock and roll might be an exaggeration, but it's not far off. At the time, many listeners suspected drug references in Happiness is a Warm Gun, even claiming the warm gun was a heroin needle. But John repeatedly denied any drug connotations. They said it was about drugs, but it wasn't, he insisted. No one believes me. It was about a gun, not heroin or anything. In those days, I had no idea about heroin. I'd never seen it or knew anybody who had touched it. A document reproduced in the Beatles Anthology suggests the song was at least partially about drugs. A copy of John's handwritten lyric sheet shows he labeled the song's 3 sections. The first as Dirty Old Man, the third as The Gunman, and tellingly, the middle section as The Junkie.
Well, I like, my dad's always sort of played fruity old songs like that, and I like them. I like the melody of old songs, and the lyrics actually as well. There's some old lyrics like, sort of a woman singing about a man, and she's saying, something about I want to have his initial on my monogram. So, you know what I mean? Yeah. Just good lyrics and just good thoughts that you don't sort of hear so much these days, And so I would quite like to have been sort of a 1920s writer, because I like that thing, the top hat and tails and sort of coming onto this kind of number. I like that thing. But so this is just me doing it, pretending I'm living in 1925.
Author Kevin Howlett suggests that Paul may have been emulating the Marilyn Monroe character Sugar Cane in the movie Some Like It Hot, which is set in 1929.
I play the ukulele and I sing, too.
Sings, too?
Well, I don't have much of a voice, but then this isn't much of a band, either. I'm only with them because I'm running away.
Fred Astaire is a bit of an inspiration to me, Paul continues. Sometimes when I'm singing, I'll pretend to be him to get that little voice. It helps me reach a very particular place. I was definitely thinking of Fred and the whole world of the silver screen when I was writing Honey Pie. I fell in love, not only with Fred, but also with all those other beautiful singers I'd heard throughout my childhood. The Beatles entered London's Trident Studios on October 1st, 1968, for what became a week's worth of recording sessions at this facility. Trident Studios were used by the group earlier in these sessions, such as with the recording of the song Hey Jude, primarily to take advantage of their 8-track recording capabilities, something EMI had yet to institute. However, by this point, the Beatles did have access to 8-track recording at EMI, so this week's work was either for a change of scenery, as Mark Lewison's book The Beatles Recording Sessions suggests, or because this week was already fully booked at EMI. In any event, they started the week off by recording the rhythm track for Paul's Honey Pie on this day, the session beginning at 4 p.m. John plays a brilliant solo on Honey Pie, George remembered in '87. It sounded like Django Reinhardt or something. One of those moments where you could just close your eyes and hit all the right notes, like a little jazz solo. According to the Beatles' recording sessions, the line "Now she's hit the big time" was heavily filtered and layered with the sound of an old phonograph to mimic a worn-out 78 RPM record. While it seemed like a fresh idea, the Monkees had already done something similar on Magnolia Sims, a track from their album The Birds, the Bees, and the Monkees. Since the Beatles were fans of the Monkees and had recently befriended them, it's possible that song inspired Paul or George Martin to try the same effect. Either way, Honey Pie was officially finished in the early hours of October 5th, with the session wrapping up at 4:30 a.m. Most people brush off Honey Pie as just filler, but when it comes to nailing a vintage-style pastiche, Paul was right on the money.
We were involved with a hell of a lot of things that we didn't particularly want to be involved in, or that maybe we did want to be involved in, but we didn't want everybody else to be involved in. So really all Apple was, it was Beatles Limited, which we changed into Apple, and we tried to pull all our own affairs together into one company. And we thought of the idea of being able to do records without having to go to somebody and say, please, can we do a record? Which we still had to do even up to, say, 2 years ago. The sort of 5 years of our success was really trying to be ourselves and trying to get control of ourselves. Now finally, we've got almost 100% control of ourselves, which again is a bit dodgy, because then it's the responsibility of whether we can be in control of ourselves. But there was a mistake made when Paul and John announced from New York that what we want to do is help everybody, all those people who have to go down on their knees.
It's a business concerning records, films and electronics, and as a sideline, whatever it's called, manufacturing or whatever. But we want to set up a system whereby people who just want to make a film about anything don't have to go on their knees in somebody's office, probably yours.
To big businesses, we want to help them so that they don't have to go down on their knees. In actual fact, that was a mistake, because yes, we would like to do that, but the trouble is that to find people, really talented people, you have to go and find them. You come across them occasionally. The people who come and knock on your door from dawn till dusk begging for money and to get a break are usually the people who have no talent at all. So we snookered ourselves a little bit, because we have all these people coming expecting us to just give them £50,000, £100,000 to make a film or to do a record or do this or do that. But the thing is, we can do that, but only in moderation, because if we don't watch it, or we'd run out of money, then we wouldn't be able to help anybody.
Savoy Truffle is a funny one, written whilst hanging out with Eric Clapton in the 60s, wrote George in his book, I Me Mine. At that time, he had a lot of cavities in his teeth and needed dental work. He always had a toothache, but he ate a lot of chocolates. He couldn't resist them, and once he saw a box, he had to eat them all. He was over at my house, and I had a box of Good News chocolates on the table, and wrote the song from the names inside the lid, Cream, Tangerine, Montélimon. From this description, it appears that Eric was actually eating the chocolates while George was writing the song. In this quote from 1977, George embellishes the story a little. He'd got this real sweet tooth, and he just had his mouth worked on. His dentist said he was through with candy, so as a tribute I wrote, he'll have to have them all pulled out after the Savoy Truffle. The truffle was some kind of sweet, just like all the rest. Cream, tangerine, ginger sling, just candy, to tease Eric Clapton. In actuality, the majority of the lyrics in the verses were taken directly from that actual box of chocolates, which has been identified as Macintosh's Good News double-center chocolate assortment. The names Cherry Cream and Coconut Fudge were invented by George, however, to round out the verses. I got stuck with the two bridges for a while, and Derek Taylor wrote some of the words in the middle. You know what you eat, you are, continued George. Apple press officer Derek Taylor explains, George said, we need a bit here, and I thought again of my good friend Alan Pariser. We had done a film called You Are What You Eat, which was a very pippy thing. Don't eat meat, man, or you'll be filled with the adrenaline of frightened animals. So I said to George, you know what you eat, you are. So that was that bit for Savoy Truffle. The film You Are What You Eat was released in September of 1968 and featured an interesting collaboration between singer-ukuleleist Tiny Tim and the band, both of which were admired by George at this time. Along with Derek's lyrical contribution to John's Happiness is a Warm Gun, this was his second collaborative effort for the White Album, neither of which he received recognition nor royalty payments for. George cleverly rhymed, you know what you eat, you are, with we all know oh blah dee blah da, possibly an inside joke between the band members as to their repeatedly having that song drilled into their heads during the extensive time it took to record that song. The other bridge George wrote simply as a warning to Eric about how when the pain comes through because of his rotten teeth, it will make him shout aloud. A week or so before George began recording the song with the Beatles on September 21st, an issue of the British magazine New Musical Express came out in which he explained how he was trying to distance himself from spiritual songwriting for the White Album. I now want to write songs that don't have any meaning because I'm a bit fed up with people coming up and saying, hey, what's it all about? What's it mean? This next album is much simpler than Pepper because it's more down to guitars, bass, and drums, and maybe a piano. I'm still all within you without you, but I don't want to go into that anymore, because now I'm being a rock and roll star. Whereas While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Long 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 have masked spiritual overtones, Savoy Truffle is straight up rock and roll with frivolous subject matter just as George intended. Interestingly, his songwriting on Savoy Truffle appears to be a reflection of John's method of finding interesting words wherever they might turn up, as seen on Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite and A Day in the Life, among many others. George Martin suggested that I score Savoy Truffle for saxophones, remembers Chris Thomas. George Martin uncharacteristically delegating this responsibility instead of tackling it himself as usual. I must say that I found it a real chore, 21-year-old Chris Thomas continues. 6 saxophonists, including Art Ellefson, were hired to record Chris Thomas's score for a 3-hour session that was to end at 6 p.m. Engineer Brian Gibson remembers, the session men were playing really well. There's nothing like a good brass section letting rip, and it sounded fantastic. But having got this really nice sound, George turned to engineer Ken Scott and said, right, I want to distort it. So I had to plug up 2 high-gain amplifiers, which overloaded and deliberately introduced a lot of distortion, completely tearing the sound to pieces and making it dirty. The musicians came up to the control room to listen to a playback, and George said to them, before you listen, I've got to apologize for what I've done to your beautiful sound. Please forgive me, but it's the way I want it. I don't think they particularly enjoyed hearing their magnificent sound screwed up quite so much, but they realized that this is what George wanted, and that it was their job to provide it. Another problem apparent at this point was the quality of the recording done at Trident Studios. Jeff Emerick says, all the Beatles tapes that had been recorded at Trident sounded peculiar to me because of what I suspected to be technical problems. I was vocal about my opinions, and word eventually got back to some people at Trident, who asked me to come in to talk to them about it. They made it clear that they would prefer it if I kept my opinion to myself in the future. Engineer Ken Scott left EMI and began working at Trident some time later. The first thing he did upon arriving was to sort out the studio's technical problems, continues Emerick. And from that point on, their tapes sounded fine. As a songwriter, George isn't really known for his sense of humor. Whether the subject matter is romance, his spiritual views, his political views, or even his love of nature, his most known compositions are mostly serious. Easily overlooked, though, is Savoy Truffle, which George himself describes as a funny one. George's liverpudly and wit kicked in to tease a good friend, who also happened to be a well-known guitar legend even back in '68. Their friendship, even after Eric married his ex-wife Patty, continued for the rest of George's life, which defines what a truly unconditional friendship should be. And if you can't tease a good friend, who can you tease?
Would you like to do it again?
Well, I wouldn't like to go out on the road and everything again. I think we could. The thing we could do was record together again. That's about it. I wouldn't fancy going on the road with it anymore. No.
Not a stage concert again?
No, we'd have to get all that makeup on and high heel sneakers. And I'm not shaving my beard off or anyone. Maybe I'll just have it dyed gold.
You just grow into being a myth.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like...
It's a lovely idea of you all being together.
It's like, well, I don't know, when those old vaudeville stars coming back, they never make it. I mean, I'm not saying we can't make it, you see. You can't answer these questions in reality.
Well, there's no question of not making it. I mean,
No.
you have a ready-made audience, wouldn't you? I mean, the thing about it is, I mean, you've all got your own.
Yes, but we stopped
separate
touring
directions
even,
now, haven't you?
after a couple of years because of what the albums. We could never reproduce that on stage.
It's in the lap of the gods.
Well, we're the gods.
Right.
Another good quote. Also, you see,
What were
even
your
when we
musical
first,
differences?
listen to all our albums.
Yes.
I mean, just listen to them and you can see where we're all going, you know. And you'd have to melt all that again, you know. So that's the difference.
Early on, the Beatles songs were all pretty much about one thing: love. Love was everywhere in their early music, but as they grew as songwriters, their topics expanded big time. They started writing about all sorts of things: novelists, weed, Eastern spirituality, murder, and even complete nonsense. So would it be weird for Paul to write a song for his 3-year-old sheepdog? Not at all. Paul recalled how the song came about.
You see, I just start singing some words with the tune, and it just, you know what I mean? I don't ever write a song thinking, now I'll write a song about. I do sometimes, but mainly I don't. And then I'm doing a tune, and then some words come into my head, you know. And these happen to be marked on my day, you know. Although I spend days in conversation. It doesn't mean anything, you know. But those just happen to come into my head. So that's what this song's about. So it is about my dog. But I don't particularly want her to remember me. Like the song is about Martha. I don't mean it. You know. But like, you make up songs. You know, you don't make up songs trying to make a serious. I don't ever try to make any sort of serious songs. I just make it because I've got to have words to use it. You know. So I make up any kind of. So, you know, you can read anything you like into it, but really. It's me singing to my dog.
When I was teaching myself piano, I liked to push myself, and this started almost as a piano lesson piece. It's quite hard for me to play, more complex than my usual style. Some people were surprised I played it at all. Then, as I was coming up with words, just making sounds, the phrase, "Martha, my dear," came out. I mostly just played chords and a bass line since we'd sing over it. I didn't want to play too much, so the melody and lyrics had space. But Martha, my dear was the most complex thing I ever did. It was actually contrapuntal, with 2 parts at once. George once told me, I could never write songs like that. You just make them up. They don't mean anything to you. I think deep down, they do mean something, but on the surface, they're often fantasy, like Desmond and Molly or Martha My Dear. I mean, I wasn't really talking to Martha. It was more of a general affectionate message, but in an abstract way. Martha was a lovely little dog. I adored her. One side effect was that John warmed up to me. He was usually very guarded because of his tough upbringing, but seeing me with Martha made him open up. Martha passed away in 1981 at 15 years old. One of her puppies, Arrow, appeared on the cover of Paul's Paul is Live album. Some lyrics, like, "Hold your head up, you silly girl," and "Hold your hand out," sound like they could be directed at a pet, but other lines suggest Paul was singing to a former love interest, possibly Jane Asher, who had recently ended their engagement due to his infidelity. Lines like, "You've always been my inspiration," "Don't forget me," and "You and me were meant to be," could hint at Jane, since Paul wrote several songs about her. "All My Loving," "We Can Work It Out," "You Won't See Me." While Paul never confirmed this, he did admit that on a deep level, his lyrics often had meaning to him, so maybe Jane was on his mind when he wrote it. Ian MacDonald, in Revolution in the Head, suggested that Happiness as a Warm Gun may have inspired Martha My Dear. He noted that Martha My Dear has a rhythmically unusual section, similar to a part of Happiness as a Warm Gun, which Paul may have written as a challenge to himself after working on John's song. Paul shared another interesting detail in his book, The Lyrics. He revealed that Martha My Dear had an unexpected inspiration, a relative who was having an affair. At the time, almost no one knew Martha was a dog, and actually, as the song goes on, Martha kind of turns into a person. "I had a relative who came to me about an affair. They wanted someone to talk to. By 1968, I was outside the usual family circle, so they felt that they could confide in me. No one else knew the song was about someone having an affair, but that's what gives you lines like, 'When you find yourself in the thick of it,' extra meaning."
The contrast.
There are plenty of Beatles songs that could be called underrated, but George's Long, Long, Long from the White Album might just be the most overlooked. Although they swore off most of their creature comforts for this spiritually rejuvenating trip, presumably including drugs, the one thing George reportedly did bring to India with him was a copy of Bob Dylan's 1966 album, Blonde on Blonde. The final track on that album, the 11-minute Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, especially struck a chord with George. In his 1980 book, I Me Mine, George admitted he didn't remember much about writing Long, 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 except for the chords. I think they were coming from Dylan's Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, D to E minor, A, and D, those three chords and the way they moved. Kevin Howlett acknowledges the similarity, but suggests it's more about the hypnotic feel both songs create rather than a direct musical parallel. Though Dylan's song influenced Long Long Long, George soon developed a close friendship with him. After the White Album's release, he traveled to Woodstock for Thanksgiving 1968, spending time with Dylan and the band. During this visit, he and Dylan co-wrote I'd Have You Anytime, which later appeared on George's album All Things Must Pass. Their collaboration continued for decades, culminating in their work together as part of the Traveling Wilburys. It wasn't until the last week of recording the White Album that George's beautiful Long 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 was first brought into the studio. This day was October 7th, 1968, the Beatles filing into EMI Studio 2 at about 2:30 p.m. for what became a marathon 16-and-a-half-hour session. The long hours undoubtedly deemed necessary because of a deadline to complete the album in time for a late November release, thereby in time for Christmas gifts around the world. After dinner, George, Paul, and Ringo, with John notably absent, as he often was for George's recordings, worked on the arrangement. Still calling it It's Been a Long, Long, Long Time, this was likely Paul and Ringo's first time hearing the song, explaining why it took 67 takes to get a solid rhythm track. Paul played Hammond organ, Ringo used a mix of his old and new drum kits, and George handled acoustic guitar and vocals. Even as fatigue set in, Paul reassured George, saying, I don't mind how long it takes. Say what you will about Long, 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 but it was the first song that George wrote that directly addresses God. The ambiguous nature of the lyrics made it appear as if he was singing to a woman. This approach was taken to make the subject matter more palatable for Beatles audiences. After all, the vast majority of Beatles songs, especially in the first half of their career, were lyrically concerning romantic relationships. Beatles fans would have no reason to think otherwise about this song. During his solo career, George had no hesitation in singing directly to God, even using his name. His spirituality mattered more to him than public opinion, so he no longer relied on ambiguous lyrics. How did fans react? Two of his openly spiritual songs, My Sweet Lord and Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, reached number 1 on US charts. Popularity was never his priority. He told Record Mirror in 1972, I don't really care if no one ever heard of me again. Yet his post-Beatles career earned him worldwide respect, and rightfully so.
We couldn't play the game anymore. We could see through each other, and therefore we felt uncomfortable, because up till then we really believed intensely in what we were doing and the product we put out, and everything had to be just right, and we believed. Suddenly we didn't believe. We couldn't do it anymore. It had come to a point where it was no longer creating magic, and the camera sort of being in the room with us made us aware of that it was a phony situation, that we'd come to a stage where we would be completely phony, no reality left. And that was the end of it.
John loved to sleep, living a pretty laid-back life in the suburbs. But when he went out in London for dinner or a club, he'd get home really late. Paul would usually show up around midday or early afternoon for a songwriting session, only to find John still in bed. You can hear John's love for sleeping in a lot of his songs, especially I'm Only Sleeping. As David Quantick points out in Revolution, the making of the Beatles' White Album, John even turned his bed into a political statement with the famous bed-in protests. Part of it was for humor, part of it was for making a point about peace, but mostly it was just because he liked being in bed. His first solo single, Give Peace a Chance, was even recorded there. So what happens when a guy like John can't get any sleep? Like during his long trip to India, where he was trying to meditate and study spiritually. That frustration turned into I'm So Tired, one of his most raw and honest songs.
I couldn't sleep, I'm meditating all day, and then I couldn't sleep at night, and we're not supposed to leave the room because we're supposed to be in one room for 5. I managed to stay in a room for 5 days without ever going out. And I was so tired, I couldn't get to sleep, and the story is there.
Looking at the lyrics, there's clearly more going on than just being tired. He missed Yoko a lot. His feelings for her show up in the lyrics, where he seems to be speaking directly to her. My mind is set on you. I wonder should I call you, but I know what you would do. I'd give you everything I've got for a little peace of mind. The Sir Walter Raleigh reference is about the man who introduced tobacco to England in the 16th century. John, a heavy smoker, clearly wasn't a fan. The word git, or get in Liverpudlian slang, is a British insult meaning an unpleasant person, and it also conveniently rhymed with cigarette. Some believe that the line, I wonder should I get up and fix myself a drink, followed by no, 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 refers to the Maharishi's strict no drugs, no alcohol rule at the retreat. The Beatles finally got around to recording John's I'm So Tired during a long session on October 8, 1968. They arrived at EMI Studio 2 around 4 p.m., with plans to record both I'm So Tired and the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. John, eager to get going, can be heard on the session tapes pushing the band forward. Quick, quick, the red light's on. Let's go. Let's make a record. They started I'm So Tired around 6 p.m., laying down the basic rhythm track. Paul played bass, Ringo drums, John and George on electric guitars, and John on lead vocal, of course. Unlike their usual process of using a guide vocal and re-recording it later, John intended this one to be the final, which was very unusual. He followed his own note from his lyric sheet, smoky then heavy voice, singing softly like Smokey Robinson in the verses and with more intensity in the choruses. It took 14 takes to get it right. Interestingly, John also recorded mumbled gibberish during the instrumental breaks. The most famous bit, at the end of the song, was later interpreted by conspiracy theorists as a hidden backwards message. It's pretty weird if you ask me. According to Mark Lewison's The Beatles recording sessions, John was actually saying, Monsieur, monsieur, how about another one? Possibly referring to another take. But in 1969, fans searching for clues to the Paul is dead rumor claimed that when played backwards, it said, Paul is dead, miss him, miss him, miss him, leading to a lot of worn-out record player needles.
One of my favorite tracks.
It is.
Yeah. I just like the sound of it, and I sing it well, and I felt in a good mood when I wrote it. Well, not in a good mood when I wrote it. I felt like that, but I felt good about it.
Many Beatles fans might be surprised to learn that John considered I'm So Tired one of his favorite songs. You'd expect classics like Strawberry Fields, Help, or Across the Universe to top his list, and you'd be right. He spoke fondly of all three at different times. But he also expressed frustration with how they turned out, feeling that the final recordings didn't fully capture his original vision. From listening to John's demo recording of I'm So Tired, which is the closest we can get to how he heard the song in his head, we can understand that, in this case, the finished track appeared to capture the mood and feel he was looking for, and then some. So for John to say he likes the sound of it was saying a lot, and I think most fans would agree. John once said in '71, "I had a sort of professional songwriter's attitude to writing pop songs. I didn't consider them, the lyrics or anything, to have any depth at all. Then I started being me about the songs. I think it was Dylan that helped me realize that." Dylan's influence on John's songwriting became clear in '64, with songs like I'm a Loser, where he started showing real emotions instead of just making pop songs for teenagers. By '68, after what he called his songwriting trough of '67, John had shifted to writing about personal experiences and what was happening around him. A great example is the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, where he used his signature wit to criticize hypocrisy based on something he saw in India that year. Paul totally got John's message in the song, especially since he was becoming a vegetarian and against killing animals. This is another of his great songs. Did you really have to shoot that tiger, is its message. Aren't you a big guy? Aren't you a brave man? I think John put it very well.
That was written about a guy who was in Maharishi's meditation camp and took a short break to go away and shoot a few poor tigers, and then came back to commune with God. And
That's hysterical.
there used to be a character called Jungle Jim and Buffalo Bill,
Yeah.
and I combined the two. And it's a sort of, teenage social comment song that was a bit of a joke. And Yoko's on that one, actually, I believe, singing along.
The guy in question was 27-year-old Richard Rick Cook III, who had come to visit his mother, Nancy Cook de Herrera. She was a longtime Maharishi follower and had even worked as his publicist in the '60s. Actress Mia Farrow, who was also there, described Nancy's arrival at the ashram. A self-important, middle-aged American woman arrived, moving a mountain of luggage into a brand new private bungalow next to Maharishi's. People fled this newcomer, and no one was sorry when she left the ashram after a short time to go tiger hunting. John described Rick in the song as the all-American bullet-headed Saxon mother's son, which Rick later admitted was a fair impression. The other Beatles were always real nice to me, but John was always aloof, he recalled. They epitomized the counterculture, and I was the classic good American boy and college athlete. There wasn't a whole bunch that we got to connect on. At 6 feet tall, wearing all white, and sporting a crew cut, he definitely stood out among the ashram crowd. Nancy, Rick, and others went on a tiger hunt near Rishikesh, riding elephants to track their prey. In a 2018 article, Rick described the experience as thrilling, admitting he shot a tiger. Their guide, Avi Kohli, explained that hunting was a tradition, especially since villagers feared tiger attacks on elephants. During the hunt, they hid in a tree on a wooden platform. When a tiger appeared, Nancy shouted, and Rick shot it through the ear. Proud of his kill, he posed for photos. The next day, Nancy excitedly told the Maharishi about it, while John and Paul overheard. Maharishi was shocked, saying, "Life destruction is life destruction." John questioned the act, asking, "Don't you call that slightly life-destructive?" Rick later told Maharishi he regretted the hunt and vowed never to kill an animal again. He quit hunting and became a photographer, eventually working 22 years with National Geographic. Meanwhile, Nancy remained close friends with George until his passing in 2001. The song's lyrics stay pretty true to the actual story, at least from John's perspective. He added humor while making a point about hypocrisy. He included details like the elephants, Rick's mother being there in case of accidents, and even his own words from the conversation, "Life destruction is life destruction." Yoko Ono took on the role of Nancy in the song, and the children, questioning whether killing was a sin, reflected what John had said to Rick. The only completely fictional part was the reference to Captain Marvel, a comic book hero, who zapped him right between the eyes. John found the comic book phrasing funny, so he threw it in as an inside joke. The song's title, The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, was inspired by Saturday morning adventure serials like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon that John grew up watching. He even included the phrase, "all the children sing," to give it a playful, sing-along feel. The song was recorded on October 8th, during an all-night session at EMI Studio 2, as the Beatles rushed to finish the record. They started at 4 p.m. and worked for 16 hours. The recording began with 3 takes of the rhythm track, featuring John on lead vocals and acoustic guitar, Yoko on backing vocals, and 1 lead line, George on guitar, Ringo on drums, and Paul on bass. They landed on take 3 as the best version and started overdubbing. Paul added extra bass, Ringo played tambourine, and producer Chris Thomas played mellotron. The big sing-along chorus included everyone in the studio, even Ringo's wife, Maureen. And that iconic Spanish guitar intro, it wasn't actually played by any of the Beatles. It came from a mellotron, a keyboard instrument that played pre-recorded tape loops of real instruments. John had fun with it, hitting a key that triggered a flamenco-style guitar riff, and decided to add it into the beginning of the song.
But I'm going to leave it all to you. It's called Why Don't We Do It on the Road? What, I suppose somebody will say somewhere.
Dance, Tony, dance.
Love it or hate it, Why Don't We Do It in the Road was something pretty bold to release in 1968. And even today, it still surprises casual fans when they first hear it. Paul explained where the idea came from in his book, Many Years From Now. I was up on the flat roof meditating, and I'd seen a troop of monkeys walking around in the jungle. A male just hopped on the back of a female and gave her one, as they say. Within 2 or 3 seconds, he hopped off again, looked around like it wasn't me, and she just wandered off as if nothing happened. A photo of this exact moment appears in Paul's book, The Lyrics. Seeing that made Paul think, bloody hell, that puts it all into a cocked hat. That's how simple sex is. This monkey just hops on, does it, and it moves on. Meanwhile, humans make such a big deal out of it. So that was basically it. Why Don't We Do It in the Road could have been about either f***ing or shitting, to put it bluntly. Why don't we do either in the road? Well, because we're civilized. But the song was just throwing the question out there, you know? It was a primitive statement, really, about sex, or about freedom. And I liked it, because it was just so outrageous. When asked about the song around the time the White Album came out, Paul explained why the Beatles had such a wide range of styles. We've always been a rock and roll group, but not just rock and roll. That's why we can do Obla-Dee Obla-Da 1 minute and this the next. Back in Hamburg, we played for all sorts of people. Some fat old businessman would come in and ask for a mambo or a rumba, and we'd have to be versatile. We don't fit into just one box. On one hand, you get I Will, which is pretty smoochy, and then you get Why Don't We Do It in the Road? Same guy wrote both. By October 9th, after 4 months of recording the album, the Beatles had more than enough songs to fill a double LP, but Paul still felt like adding one more track. That night, while the others were busy with mixing and overdubs, he grabbed engineer Ken Townsend and recorded Why Don't We Do It in the Road by himself in EMI Studio One. Townsend later joked that his 1 minute 40 seconds claim to fame was being the engineer on this song. Since Paul was the only one in the studio, he was effectively producing the session himself. Later that day, October 10th, Paul grabbed Ringo and Ken Townsend again to finish the track, while John and George were busy elsewhere. But how did John and George feel about being left out?
He even recorded that all by himself in the other room. That's how it was getting those days. We came in and he made the whole record. Him drumming, him playing the piano, him singing. No, just because it was getting to be where he wanted to do it like that, but he couldn't, maybe he couldn't make the break from the Beatles. I don't know what it was, but you know, I enjoyed the track, but we were all, I'm sure, I can't speak for Jordan, I was always hurt when he knocked something off without involving us, you know? But that's just the way it was then.
Paul, on the other hand, didn't see it as a big deal. He told Hunter Davies in 1981, John and George were busy, and me and Ringo had free time, so I said, let's go do this. It wasn't a deliberate thing. John did the same with Revolution 9. He went off and made that without me, but nobody ever mentions that. Ringo didn't think it was a problem either. The Ballad of John and Yoko only had Paul on it, but that was fine. Why Don't We Do It in the Road was just Paul and me, and it still went out as a Beatles track. No issue.
It was great, and then the White Album really took off, and like Year Blues, the track Year Blues was great. We all left the studio and went to a little room, so there's no separation, and there was lots of group activity going down. I loved the White Album.
There was a lot more individual stuff. For the first time, I think people were accepting that it was individual. Like, I remember having 3 studios operating at the same time. Paul was doing some overdubs in one, and John was doing something in another one, and I was doing horns on something else in another studio, because maybe they'd set a release date and time was running out.
By '68, the days of all 4 Beatles playing on every song were long gone. Early on, it was rare for a Beatle to sit out, but that changed on June 14th, 1965, when Paul recorded Yesterday all by himself. From then on, he got comfortable doing solo recordings, with 3 tracks on the White Album featuring only him. George and Ringo had also done their own solo Beatles recordings, Within You Without You and Good Night. So you'd think John would have done the same earlier, especially since he was feeling confident during the White Album sessions. But that wasn't the case. But with the album nearly finished and some encouragement from Paul, John finally recorded his one and only solo Beatles song, the deeply personal Julia. Julia was my mother, John explained. The song was actually a combination of an image of Yoko and my mother blended into one, you see. John was raised by his Aunt Mimi, but had a close bond with his mother, Julia, especially in his teenage years. Unlike Mimi, who wanted him to focus on a proper career, Julia fully supported his love of music. She bought him his first guitar, taught him chords, even if they were banjo chords, and shared his love for rock and roll. Her sudden death in a car accident on July 15, 1958, was devastating for him. I lost her twice, John once said. Once as a 5-year-old when I moved in with my auntie, and once again when she physically died. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. We'd caught up so much. We could communicate. We got on. She was great. Knowing that John also called Yoko Mother, it makes sense that Julia was about both Julia and Yoko. The lyric Ocean Child refers to the meaning of Yoko's name, which means child of the sea in Japanese. Some of the lyrics were also inspired by Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese poet popular in the 1960s. The opening line of Julia, half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, comes from Gibran's book, Sand and Foam, which includes the line, half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it so the other half may reach you. Another line, when I cannot sing my heart, I can only speak my mind, was likely influenced by Gibran's, when life does not find a singer to follow her heart, she produces a philosopher to speak her mind. John, though, said in '72 that Yoko helped me with this one. Most likely, he meant that her poetic phrases and influence helped shape the song. In a 2016 interview, Donovan revealed he played a considerable role in the song. As John was in this period of tuition with me, he told me he wanted to write a song about his mother. He said, Donovan, you're the king of children's songs. Can you help me? I helped him with a couple of lines. Seashell eyes, windy smile. For the Lewis Carroll Alice in Wonderland feel that John loves so much. John brought Julia to EMI Studio 2 on October 13th, on a Sunday. It was actually the last song recorded for the album, replacing Not Guilty and What's the New Mary Jane. Even though EMI had 8-track machines by then, they only used 4-track for this simple recording. The session started at 7 p.m., with John doing several takes of just his guitar and vocals. At one point, he asked producer George Martin and Paul, "Is it better standing up, you think?" Then he admitted, "It's very hard to sing this, you know." To which Martin agreed, "It's a very hard song, John." John kept experimenting, saying, "Maybe I should strum it first," before running through a couple of verses without the fingerpicking. But eventually he stuck with the Travis picking style. He recorded 3 proper takes, finally nailing it on take 3. After that, he layered more guitar and vocals, with some lines overlapping. By 1 a.m., the song was complete. Music critic Tim Riley perfectly sums up Julia in his book, Tell Me Why. The voice and guitar interplay is expert, independent yet complementary. The private world he reveals alone with his guitar is like a therapeutic confessional. It's interesting that John waited until the very end of the White Album sessions to record the song. Maybe he wasn't sure about including such a personal track? Still, it's a good thing he decided to record it. It's one of the most beautiful and heartfelt songs he ever wrote.
I think a lot of people expected another step from Sgt. Pepper. Well, it is another step, but it's not necessarily in the way people expected. On Sgt. Pepper, we had more instrumentation than we never had, more orchestral stuff than we'd ever used before. So it was more of a production. But we didn't really want to go overboard on that this time. And we've tried to play more like a band this time, only using instruments when we have to, instead of just using them for the fun of it.
Is this for any sort of concept of being able to do the things live?
Yeah, and also for the concept that we like playing together. That's the main concept.
When they did the White Album, I thought we should have made probably a very, very good single album out of it, rather than making a double album.
Well, no, I agree. We should have put it out as 2 separate albums, the White and the Whiter album. A lot of information on a double album.
But what do you do when you've got all them songs and you want to get rid of them so you can do more songs? There was a lot of ego in that band, and there was a lot of songs that should have just maybe been elbowed or made into B-sides.
Some people call it the best thing since Sgt. Pepper. Other people panned it. It was such a wide variety. How do you feel about it now?
Well, I think in a way it was a mistake doing 4 sides, because first of all, it's too big for people to really get into it, for reviewers and also the public. Maybe now people have bought it, and if they've really listened to it for years or since it was out, then they'll have their own favourites. And there's a couple of things that we could have done without on the album, and maybe if we'd have made it just compact, 14 songs, say.
I think it was an album which could have been made a fantastically good album if it had been compressed a bit and condensed. But a lot of people I know think it's still the best album they made. So it's not my view, but horses for courses.
Well, you can always say that. As you say, it's perhaps I'll go with. Not definitely. I mean, in fact, I think it's a fine little album. And I think the fact that it's got so much on it is one of the things that's cool about it. Because they're very varied stuff, Rocky Raccoon, Piggies, Happiness is a Warm Guns, that kind of stuff, I think it's a fine album. I'm not a great one for that, maybe it was too many of that. Look, what do you mean? It was great, it's sold, it's the bloody Beatles White Album, shut up.
Once the whole album was complete, there was some ambivalence as to whether it would be a 2-disc set or not. John explained it this way in 1969. It's pretty hard trying to fit 3 guys' music into one album. That's why we did a double. Different ideas were thrown around for the cover of this album, the extravagant Sgt. Pepper cover being quite a hard act to follow. One idea was having a transparent cover, which would expose a color photograph when the album was removed. 2 different, elaborate covers had been prepared by different artists, one consisting of a drawing of a water scene with the images of the Beatles' faces on the side of a nearby cliff, not unlike Mount Rushmore. The other proposed cover was an interesting painting by artist John Patrick Byrne, which ended up being used on a Netherlands Beatles album called De Mooiste Songs, as well as on the British compilation album, The Beatles Ballads. Wanting to do something a bit more artsy, Paul approached Robert Fraser for ideas, who suggested he meet with Richard Hamilton, who has been credited as the actual inventor of pop art. Since Sgt. Pepper was so over the top, Richard Hamilton recalls, I explained, I would be inclined to do a very prissy thing, almost like a limited edition. Paul didn't discourage me, so I went on to propose a plain white album. If that were too clean and empty, then maybe we could print a ring of brown stain to look as if a coffee cup had been left on it. But that was thought a bit too flippant. I also suggested that they might number each copy to create the ironic situation of a numbered edition of something like 5 million copies. This was agreed upon, but then I began to feel a bit guilty about putting their double album under the plain wrappers. Even the lettering is casual, almost invisible, a blind stamping. I suggested it could be jazzed up with a large edition print, an insert that would be even more glamorous than a normal sleeve. Another idea proposed by Richard Hamilton, because of the debut of Apple Records, was to bounce an apple on a bit of paper and get a smudge, a very light green smear with a little bit of pulp. That idea, according to Paul, went by the wayside. As for the name of the album, the working title had been A Doll's House, named after the popular play by Henrik Ibsen. But this had to be dropped because the progressive rock band Family had released an album called Music in a Doll's House earlier in the year. Paul remembers, Richard asked, has there been an album called The Beatles? So I referred back to EMI and they said, no. There's been Meet the Beatles, introducing the Beatles in America, but there's never been an album called The Beatles. So he said, let's call it that, which is the official title of the White Album. As for the insert for the album, Paul relates, Richard said, have you got any old photos of the Beatles? They must all have family photos from when they were young, or any nice photos. Give me a lot of source material. So I acted as the middleman. I went to the guys and said, childhood photos, what have you got? Look in your cupboards. New photos if you want, whatever you'd like. And they brought in stuff from the bottom drawer that their mums had kept, along with their old rent books and all the old baby pictures. I told him, my wife's a photographer. She's got pretty cool stuff. Would you like to look at that? He said, yes. So I took that out to him as well. A montage of these pictures was assembled for the insert, the lyrics to all of the songs printed on the opposite side. Also included in the set were glossy John Kelly color pictures of each member of the group. As for the numbered editions printed on the front cover of the initial releases, it wasn't feasibly possible to accurately number each copy with a unique number because of its worldwide release and multiple printing facilities. I think EMI only did this on a few thousand and then just immediately gave up. Paul relates in his book many years from now. We got the first 4. I don't know where mine is, of course. Everything got lost. It's all coming up in Sotheby's, I imagine. John got 0001 because he shouted the loudest. He said, Bagsy number 1! He knew the game. You have to baggy it. Since it had been nearly a full year since a Beatles album had been released, which in the 60s seemed like a lifetime, a new Beatles album was in high demand. This being the case, even though it was a higher-priced double album, listing at $11.79, it debuted on the US Billboard album chart at number 11, and only 2 weeks later, it made it to the top spot, and stayed there for 6 weeks in a row. All in all, it spent 9 weeks at number 1 and a total of 155 weeks on the Billboard album chart. The album sold 9.5 million copies in the US, and is the most certified Beatles album, at 19 times platinum. John retrospectively went on record to describe the White Album as a disjointed affair. That was just saying, this is my song, we'll do it this way. That's your song, you do it that way. Every track is an individual track. There isn't any Beatle music on it. It was John and the band, Paul and the band, George and the band. Still, the White Album is chaotic in the best way possible. It's all over the place, but that's what makes it great. Fans don't love it because every track is flawless, they love it because even the weird ones belong. But this sprawling, experimental approach also signaled trouble. After the unity of Pepper and the loss of their manager Brian Epstein, cracks were showing. If the album feels like a collection of solo efforts, it also reveals a lot about where each Beatle was at the time. John was both sarcastic, Glass Onion, and deeply personal in Julia. Paul was flipping between soft, catchy tunes, Obla Di, Obla Da, and some of the heaviest rockers, Helter Skelter. George kept refining his spiritual side while pushing himself musically, like While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Even Ringo got in on the action with a solid country tune, Don't Pass Me By. In the end, the White Album made the Beatles feel more human. After years of perfection, they were suddenly messy, uncertain, and scattered, and that made them even more fascinating. Thank you all for watching. This was the hardest documentary to make ever. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and leaving a comment. It makes a big difference in helping the channel with YouTube's algorithm. You might also want to join our member program. For only $1.99 a month, you get access to exclusive perks, like members-only videos, deluxe editions of our documentaries, early access to videos, member polls, and more. A special thank you to all of our amazing members. We wouldn't be able to do it without all of you. That's all we have for you today. See you next time.